The bridge was abuzz, not with panic or dread, but with excitement. The crew of the Diverse, a Titan-class freighter leased to a federal asteroid mining organization, had just completed a successful delivery of sterling silver in a record-breaking 2.34 cycles. Command had just radioed in saying that the new organization record called for celebration and bonuses were promised all around. Even the veteran Captain Marzell couldn't help but smile as he sat in the rigid and angular captain's chair in the center of the circular room. 2 times now he'd set records. His Turg lifespan had made it easy for the reptilian to gain decades of experience, something he called upon with alarming regularity now that new predatory pirates had been interfering with once safe shipping routes. Somebody clapped him on the shoulder and Marzell turned his long head over to see the toothy grin of one of his first mates. "Can you believe it? 2 company records. What's next? Finding a way to teleport living matter, eh?" Grimp, another Turg, had served with Marzell since he had first been promoted to captain, and had his name carved into the stone archway outside of HQ. He spoke with an unusually guttural voice, even for a Turg. "Ha ha, maybe. I think I'll leave the sciency stuff to our eggheads," Marzell said with a cheeky grin and glance to Morik, the chief scientific advisor, who indeed did have an egg-shaped head. "Hurrah!" came the excited response as the giant Turg slunk away back to his post, scarred visage making some of the newer recruits, especially those from more peaceful herbivorous prey species, glance nervously in his direction. Grimp's military history was the subject of many a hurried whispered conversation shared between greenhorns over rations. Marzell couldn't help but chuckle. Grimp liked his personal space, but the Turg wouldn't hurt a fly. Not anymore, that is. He liked growing succulents and reading tenpenny romance novels. Hell, he even had a tiny pair of spectacles he refused to trade in for government-funded vision treatments. Marzell wouldn't tell a soul, though. Grimp was one of his best friends and most trusted advisor. Marzell had to turn down his translator as the half-dozen excited languages buzzing around him became overwhelming. He stared out the viewport satisfied with a good season's work, proud of his crew and of his ship. He decided he was due a good nap. Nothing demanded his immediate attention, so he pressed a few pleasantly illuminated blue buttons on his keypad. "Hello, Marzell," came the ambiguous voice of Ed 121 Ed, the computer that handled most of the boring diagnostic tasks usually left to interns' new hires. "Hey Ed, just don't burn down the house, okay? I'm going to get some R&R. There was a reason why the Diverse hadn't force-wiped and updated Ed. They liked it, they liked his personality. Still hadn't figured out if Ed was a he or she AI system, officially that is. "So as you say, shall it be done?" It was a standard greeting, but it checked all courtesy boxes for most species. Or was it races? Marzell didn't know, nor did he really care. Both words were used interchangeably by everybody on the Diverse, and nobody really cared for Command's language of compliance briefs. Everybody on the Diverse had weathered all manner of catastrophes together. "Thicker than thieves" was the motto painted in big white letters on the rectangular ship. Nobody took things said in jest too seriously. It was when someone put on a serious face that people paid attention and put aside bickering, even playful banter. Marzell slid out of the chair and walked in his usual hunched-over T-Rex-style gait. He refused to walk in the traditional 4-legged way or on 2 legs like most other species. He liked his hybrid slouched way of walking. Security was light, and people were happy. A simple card swipe through the keypad of major doors got Marzell where he wanted to go. He hated the white backlit walls and boring gray catwalks. Despite his years, he never found himself drawn to the same corporate architecture of newer ships and modern buildings. An audible hiss or relief escapes his gray curled-back scaly lips as he walks into the common area at the center of the ship, which had been built to accommodate the 8 different species that made their home on the Diverse. Various posters of a dozen different species pinups plastered on the walls, along with corny corporate motivation posters and comics. Marzell weaved through the tables for the porthole that led to the officers' quarters, nodding to Dayan and Dayan, the 2 Trivoke lovers with the same name, that were completely unaware of the fact that everyone and their family knew about their romance. Dayan stood and walked toward the crew's quarters. Marzell didn't see anything else, but knew that Dayan would soon follow his friend for some quality time together. Marzell chuckled, remembering when Dayan too everybody called him Dar got assigned to the freighter, all the trivolks looked the same. Took weeks before people stopped getting the two confused. Grimp had ordered that they wore different colored clothes as a shortcut. Dayan too got the nickname Dar for the darker colors he wore, and Dayan 1 was just Dayan. Marzell had to stoop to fit through the door to his quarters. Turgs were relatively new to the intergalactic scene, only having achieved FTL travel on their own just under 200 years ago. Current intergalactic law dictates that only when individuals reach FTL can they be introduced to the Federation. Turgs are the newest sapient species on the Council, and Marzell was only a boy when all of that political nonsense went down. He vowed to make his fortune far from the hot desert homeworld he was spawned from, and instead in the stars above. Every day he woke and went to work was a good day in the old Turg's eyes. Turgs didn't wear much in the way of clothing, nothing to cover up. Command dictated that officers needed to wear a uniform though. So, Marzell every morning squeezed into the restrictive polyester gray, red, and black uniform with its gold stripes down the side and stood up straight. Marzell fumbled with the oversized zipper, pulling off the shirt and crawling up onto the heated slate ledge where he slept. Despite his excitement, his old bones needed their rest, and he found himself dozing off immediately. He rolled over to expose his soft belly to the warm ceramic heat bulbs. His translator was muted. Marzell heard nothing of the angry buzzing alarms that started to sound in the halls immediately after he retreated into his room. Dayan had to physically rouse the captain after bypassing the privacy restrictions for the captain's dorm. Marzell was instantly awake as he surveyed the panicky trivolk. Granted, trivolks usually looked panicked with their big beady eyes and fidgety six-fingered hands. He turned up his translator and flinched at the sudden loudness. Captain, there is something wrong. I'm sorry for barging in. Dayan withdrew his hand and set himself to fidgeting with his identification, whilst Badge backing into the corner. It's fine. You did the right thing. Just make sure your post isn't abandoned. Why, yes, sir, Darren squeaked and darted off stubby legs, making little fip-fap noises on the metal floor grates. Marzell squeezed back into his shirt, not bothering to zip it up, and stooped again to get out of his room, pressing the talk button on his transmitter. Talk to me, Grimp, Marzell said hurriedly into the mic as he rushed back toward the bridge. Security was out en masse, never a good sign. Getting a peculiar signal. Or was getting a peculiar signal. We're pretty sure it's a distress signal, or was a distress signal. Sorry, it's weird, even from what I've seen. Just get down here, okay? Grimp refused to say anything more, which only served to confuse and alarm Marzell more. The security officers that stood beside the bridge doors were eerie, casting long, flickering shadows in the red, blinking lights. Things went from peacetime to wartime in no time flat. The two guards stepped aside as Marzell entered the bridge. Grimp immediately stepped forward to provide the needed information. For exactly 27.34 seconds, we received a signal on the lower power frequencies usually reserved for emergencies. But it wasn't marked with any of the standard emergency procedures. Hell, we don't even know what language the sender spoke. Appearing on the screen arm of the captain's chair was a long list of data that Marzell scanned as Grimp spoke. Play it back for me. I'll see if it warrants a response. Onto the big screen overlaid with the viewport came an audio visualizer. Marzell leaned forward, primal instincts ordering him to get closer to the potential threat as the garbled, squeaky voice spoke in a panicked tone. Dimly in the background could be heard several other almost identical voices. Or were they even voices? They couldn't be voices, too squeaky. Then almost as quickly as the transmission had begun, there were several distinct pops, and then it cut out. Marzell's interest was sufficiently piqued. Everyone on deck had stopped whatever they had been doing to watch the screen. Then the face of their captain. How long till we know from where it was coming? Asked Marzell, glancing back to Grimp. Right about now. Blinking on the datapad, and Marzell surveyed it. It looks like it is coming from the Sol system. My records indicate that there are no Federation ships there. Maybe some private company? Grimp's voice was reserved. Something about the transmission was clearly unnerving to him. I don't know what language was that. Marzell's mind raced. There weren't any registered sentient sapient species in the Sol system. Had they found a new species? His name really would go up in lights if they had. We have no idea. Ed isn't pulling anything up, please advise again. An unusual little waver in Grimp's voice. What troubles you? I can hear it in your voice, Marzell asked, waving off the crew and pulling Grimp in close. Those pops, they sound an awful lot like the discharging of a high-powered kinetic weapon. Only pirates use kinetics. We should wait for the authorities. I can't in good concise leave an unanswered distress call, even a strange one besides. If it were pirates, our translators would catch their languages. You're the captain. Marzell would have to ease Grimp's strained army nerves later. For now, curiosity may kill this cat. Marzell barked orders, electronically enhanced voice leaving hissing notes in the ears of his crew. Quietly in a corner came the echoing notes of music the gunners played to help with cadences. Marzell knew better than to interfere with the squat, thick-armed loaders that kept their pirate deterrent at the ready. Everyone held on as the ship lurched. Diversity was an old ship. Didn't have as many bells and whistles as the newer, sleeker Federation ships. Could always count on the old girl, though. Someone radioed HQ, letting them know the urgency of the situation, and that they'd be behind schedule. Their FTL disengaged upon a grisly sight. The viewport darkened and became transparent, revealing the wreckage of what used to be a ship, and gasps were suppressed all along the bridge. Pirates didn't scuttle ships, they captured them and sold them for scrap. The Diverse lurched closer, stabilizing engines flaring to life, keeping it from impacting the ship. Strange block runes came into the light. Not even Ed could decipher them. How long have their engines been dead in the water? Marzell asked Mort, his chief engineer. Since we received the transmission. Engines are still warm. Scan for life. The ship is huge, and the whole crew can't have just vanished. Marzell's eyes were glued to the viewport. A subtle pinging sound as the sonar bounced off of the ship. There weren't even numbers insignia, anything designating the name and purpose of the ship. It also became apparent that the crew had bailed, as all the escape pods had been deployed. Broaden the search parameters. See if the escape pods can be found anywhere. Belay that. I found them. As the unknown ship finished its revolution, the wreckage of the escape pods became visible, and noises of disgust were barely suppressed across the bridge. Nobody fired upon escape pods, not even pirates. Even they knew that they had to respect some of the Federation rules, lest they receive no mercy when it was their time to flee. This was something else. This was sinister, cruel, calculated. My gods above, who would do such a thing? Was the only identifiable response that Marzell could hear. Marzell glanced at the engineer who had been doing the scan. Just one single life form. Then let's go get it. I want some answers. There should be some computers aboard. Marzell stood and headed out the one door again. Grimp and the chief engineering officer Mort, along with two security officers Matt and Pat, geared up for the excursion. Never can take too many chances. Marzell snapped on his helmet. The sensors couldn't pick up if the hull had been breached or if the air was breathable. Marzell led the way into the little shuttle that had been added onto the Diverse for diplomatic meetings and scouting sessions. A hydraulic hiss emanates as the cabin depressurizes and drifts away from the Diverse. The little shuttle inched closer at a painfully slow pace. The Diverse was fast, and that was no secret. Marzell sometimes became irritated with the slowness of other ships. The tense atmosphere was not aided by the fact that a space gear-clad appendage, severed from its torso, floated across the reinforced glass viewport, revolving slowly in the frictionless void of space. The rickety by comparison shuttle bumped clumsily into the corroded docking port of the mystery ship, answering the question about breathable air. Something had cut its way into the ship through the airlock. This couldn't be pirates, not even bastard pirates. They got what they wanted because of fear. Sometimes unreasonable fear, but fear all the same. They rarely had to resort to violence on a ship they boarded. As the two security officers led the way, weapons drawn, Marzell reflects on the realization that perhaps this wasn't motivated by resources or even war. This seemed to be motivated by hate. Marzell peered into the gray steel hallways. Some places were smeared with red and pockmarked with impacts of some kinetic weapon. Aside from that, and the little brass cylinders piled underneath red smears, there was no sign of the crew. The hallways were winding, almost like a snarl of disorderly cables rather than a ship. The engines were ancient FLT, seemingly cobbled together from scavenged pieces. Marzell, despite his 3D model detailing where he needed to go to find the bridge, and then the life form became lost twice, each step bringing new questions and confusing him further. His foot knocked against the little brass cylinders that lined the hallways, creating an ominous metallic rattling sound. The halls that were still even when empty and marked with the signs of tragedy seemed warm, lived in, and inviting. Behind him the chief engineer vomited, expelling the contents of his stomach across the smooth metal floor. More of that block runic writing lined the walls with arrows pointing to different places. As they got closer to the bridge more and more frequently, they saw the same arrangement of 6 letters. The mag-locked door had to be pried open, for those who had once been inside had welded it shut. Not that it had done them any good. Their disrespectful assailants had simply corroded their way in through the wall. That much was obvious. A miniature-sized vac suit lay discarded on the byway. It was clearly intended for a child. This confused Marzell. The closest thing he knew of that this ship looked like was a freighter. Freighters didn't allow children. Not even if they were related to the captain or any of the higher-ranking officers. Mort tried in vain to plug his datapad into the center console at the captain's chair. He had to do it manually. Grimp and Amat would stay behind. Marzell and Pat would proceed to the location of the lifeform marked on the datapad. Marzell followed Pat through the winding hallways, occasionally muttering directions. Whoever had built this ship hadn't used any noise-muffling polymers. He couldn't imagine how deafening it had been when the ship was being attacked. One thing he did recognize was the bright red cross on the door and around the room. He entered at a prompt by the datapad. It made sense that at least the universal sign of medical aid would be recognized by the entirety of the galaxy. This was the first room with lights that worked. Auxiliary power had clearly been rerouted to keep some terminally ill alive. Marzell flipped off the light on his helmet, the shadows cast by it proving to be harmful in the wavering light. Marzell prayed that whatever it was that they would find would be something friendly, and not one of the beings that caused this mess. It was Pat that found it, propped up in a corner, head lolled and swathed in spacefaring gear. Civilian vac suit ragged and torn in 2 places. The shaded visor of its helmet was cracked and repaired with tape. The body seemed wrong, small, feeble, with only 2 arms and 2 legs, clearly bipedal and carbon-based due to the red blood. It sat in a pool of an open first aid kit was spilled across its lap. "What the hell is this thing?" came the confused retort from Pat, the security officer. "I've never seen anything like it. I mean, I've seen bipedal aliens, but never one so small or so pale." "I don't know. What's that on its leg?" "Some bandage? I'm not a medi. We need to get back. I don't like how this ship makes me feel." Marzell nodded and moved to help Pat pick up the limp form. Perhaps it had the answers he so craved. It felt strangely light, as if it were drained, merely a shell. Despite the uniqueness of the foreign architecture, Marzell found himself slipping into a dull monotony as his thoughts overtook him. He hoped that Mort had found something useful. He passed off the mystery species to Matt, who was more medically inclined, and stooped toward Mort. "Find anything useful?" Marzell asked tentatively. "Nope. Not a thing. Damn translator can't decipher this untidy scrawl." Mort gestured frustratedly at the bluish screen he was hunched over. "Only thing is that I can't find anything indicating what this ship was for. No supply records, no military-looking designations, nothing." "Why do I get the hunch that's not a good thing?" Mort looked up at the creature. "Perhaps it could give us some answers," he said with a nod. Marzell hoped so. The 2 security officers remained hunched over the critter, quiet, hushed conversation, barely audible as Marzell passed them. Primitive medical practice. What was it thinking? Might lose it, was all that he caught. "We're leaving." "I don't like this," Marzell said somewhat aggressively, the whole air of the place getting to him. "Couldn't agree more." You know what that thing is? Grimp's eyes had not left the bloodied alien the security officers were fawning over. No idea. This whole place seems to hold its cards close to its chest. Maybe Ed back on the ship has some better ideas. Never in Marzell's decades had he seen a ship like this one. The twisting hallways, unnerving friendliness that seemed to be like the alluring clutches of a spider, the strange block runes. Nothing added up, from the echoey nature of the ship's construction to the brutal enemy that had butchered the crew and left no trace of their corpses. Aside from the solitary arm they had seen when they entered and the somehow still alive passenger, all of these thoughts and so many possibilities bumped through his head as he walked back toward the shuttle. No comms at all had been received or sent. The hull must be made of lead. The second the shuttle had been detached, their radios were abuzz with delayed comms all across the spectrum of worried. Grimp handled it as Marzell squatted into the captain's chair to direct the shuttle away from the Titanic ghost ship. Marzell chuckled as the indignant radio operator on the other side shouted so loud that she could be heard through the helmet that Grimp wore. Marzell had a refreshing challenge with steering the shuttle through the wreckage of the escape pods. He didn't see the severed arm again. Grimp had revealed the new species over the radio, so when the airlock opened, Matt and Pat had to physically restrain the crew who were all craning their necks for a glance at the new thing. Marzell and Grimp carried the bipedal critter on a stretcher, which it barely filled up. Marzell led Grimp to the medbay and barked at the attendant to ready a bed. Gently the alien was laid down. It seemed that any strong movements would break it. "Ed," Marzell shouted. "Evening, Marzell. How can I be of service?" came the chipper reply. "What is this thing? Nobody here has any idea." A greenish light scans the creature, which was pale, gaunt, and mostly hairless. "That is a human, between the ages of 14-17, male and mostly dead." "That is a human, between the ages of 14-17, male and mostly dead." How can it be mostly dead? It's either dead or it isn't. Explain yourself." Marzell sputtered, breaking the somewhat uncomfortable silence that had fallen after the cryptic words of Ed. Mostly dead refers to the fact that a large portion of the body's tissue has died, at least on a local level, fortunately for it. The tissue damage seems to be localized to the appendages. "Can you not smell? It must reek." Ed replied in his standard monotone. Marzell paused for a moment and had to step back as the four-armed medical attendant guru pried off the human's helmet. The sight reminded him to remove his own. The air tasted of cold, dried blood and faint fear chemicals. This whole operation had been a massive miscarriage of protocol. Nobody had bothered to decontaminate the human or even remove their protective vac suits. Ed was right. The human had 2 orange cords wrapped tightly around its left arm and leg. Just below the cord things were open, violent-looking wounds. Marzell had to admire the clear survival instinct that this human possessed in obvious abundance. It had lost lots of its blood and had chosen to cut off completely the blood flow of 2 of its limbs to avoid death by blood loss. Marzell remembered something similar in the mandatory first aid classes he took when he had enlisted and begun training to be a pilot. Tourniquets were to be used as an absolute last-ditch effort. These looked like they'd been on for hours and explained Ed's quip about dead tissue. There wasn't anything that the attendant could do. Not even the tech they had on hand could revive dead tissue, and he'd lose the affected appendages. "Everybody out, now." The attendant had come to the realization faster than Marzell had. At least someone was sticking to protocol. Marzell trudged out of the room and into his crew. More than 20 of the crew members had crammed themselves into the atrium of the medbay. All of them craned their necks and strained their eyes for a glance at the new species. Matt and Pat were trying their best to keep everyone at bay, but they stopped trying when Marzell stepped through the doors. Immediately he was bombarded with questions, comments, and accusations. "What is that thing? What did that to the ship? Where did the signal come from?" Marzell raised his hands and pushed aside some of the crew that had gotten too close, and silence fell over the packed chamber. "We don't know anything. The ship was empty aside from whatever that is. Our datapads couldn't decipher the alien language. The attackers left no traces. At all. Aside from the alien. We're going to wait until the attendant discharges or stabilizes him, Marzell said, keeping his voice low and even. Marzell omitted a few details. You didn't become captain and stay the captain by being completely and totally honest all of the time. Is that going to happen to all of us? Came the unmistakable quaver of Darren's voice. Of course not. The assailants were long gone. The only thing we can do is keep going. I'll let you know more when I know more. Marzell waved the crew away. Let them form their own opinions. Many probably wouldn't be far from the truth. That seemed to satisfy the crew that had assembled in the room, and they began filing out of the hallway and back to their respective posts. Heads all across the ship were soon to be bowed in hushed conversations. Marzell stood for a moment lagging behind to glance back in the direction of the human before hurriedly walking toward the bridge, rolling over everything in his head. His brooding made him almost collide with Grimp. The two Turgs marched side by side toward the beeping lights and glowing screens of the bridge. For a while, the only sound is the muffled heavy footfalls of their scaly feet and the hum of machinery in the walls around them. I just don't understand how they missed it. Grimp finally spoke, stopping in his tracks. Asterisk, that's asterisk, what's got you stumped? Not the missing crew? Not the mystery ship? Not the fact that the Red Cross exists even when their language is mere gibberish? Marzell stopped himself and turned back, looking up at his companion. Come on, Marzell, think about it. The whole damn ship is pockmarked with little corroded holes. That had to be a highly coordinated, highly skilled adversary that overwhelmed the ship with numbers or blinding speed. If they struck with speed, there had to be some crew that got spaced. All we saw was an arm. If it was numbers, why aren't there any discarded attackers' corpses? I saw hundreds of empty kinetic ammunition cartridges. It just doesn't add up. Marzell knew Grimp was conflicted and angry. He never spoke quickly, and all of that came out in a jumbled waterfall. Marzell was silent. He knew he should tell Grimp everything he knew, but he didn't want to further antagonize his friend. He hoped HQ, Ed, or the human would have some supplemental information that might be of use in the situation. Things didn't look good for the human, though. Losing 2 appendages was traumatic for any species, even those with regenerative abilities. Going further, how in the hell does an unknown species achieve FTL travel and still remain under the radar, let alone not advance beyond kinetic weapons, or make it into the Sol system? The only good that comes from there are gases extracted from its gas giants. Any of its planets of rock are too close to its sun to sustain life. Grimp was analytical, that was no secret. He could guess the twist of a book or movie by the first few chapters. The thing, it's not an unknown species. Ed knew exactly what it was. Said it was a human, whatever that is, Marzell retorted, a little irritated with Grimp. He felt now wasn't the time. What the hell is a human? Grimp was speechless, and his thought died in his throat. Marzell did a sharp about face and resumed walking toward the bridge. Matt and Pat weren't at their usual post beside the door, likely having moved to secure the human in the medbay. Marzell walked back to his chair and sat down stiffly. He was not looking forward to the paperwork. Marzell sighed. Here she came now, the Trivoc attendant in charge of drafting up reports. Marzell glanced first at his datapad. 2 missed summons. This whole thing might blow up in his face. Then at the waiting Trivoc. I'm assuming this can't be delayed? Marzell groaned slightly when she shook her head. You've already missed 2 summons, sir. HQ wants some information. We'll be late for our next delivery, they say. Her voice was smooth and light, just like all Trivocs. Tell them I don't know anything, that the computers revealed nothing. Marzell was distracted, and the attendant noticed. So do the same thing we did back on Holt 4? She said, swaying slightly as she blinked rapidly, coating her eyes in protective saliva. That would be perfect. Keep them off my back until the Medis do their jobs, Marzell chuckled, an odd ability unique almost completely to the Turgs. The Trivoc bowed, clutching their datapad to their chest and scampering away to make some excuse to HQ. Marzell, despite his feeling of dread, couldn't bring himself to leave the wreckage of the unknown ship behind. Deadlines be damned, he knew everyone on the ship wanted to know more. The Diverse was nothing without its crew, and Marzell needed to keep them happy. He presses a few buttons on his datapad and orders Mort back onto the mystery ship to examine the engines. Perhaps knowing how the engines were built could give some clues as to where the ship came from. It had been days since Marzell's last meal, his turg biology affording him long breaks between meals that sometimes proved useful in lean times. However, the added stress of all the unknowns bouncing around in his head had made him hungry. He reflected as he ordered Grimp to take over and walked out of the bridge that it was not a good day for Command's sheltering protocol or any protocols for that matter. Marzell entered the common room oblivious to anything happening around him. He stepped delicately to the synthesizer built into the wall, selecting a portion appropriate for his species and age. He stood straight as his curved spine would allow, and tall, waiting patiently for the synthesizer to finish dispensing its high-calorie gray and brown paste. He had decided to enjoy his meal in the privacy of his quarters. He could satisfy his curiosity and not worry about Command or any of the crew. Besides, it was late. Lots had happened in the last 2 cycles and Marzell was tired. He needed his rest and warmth. Sustenance obtained, Marzell trudged toward his room. His quarters were still darkened and heated from earlier. Marzell sat at his desk and double-tapped the datapad on the smooth aluminum surface. It flared to life and Marzell called for Ed as he ate, slurping up the tasteless goop. "Evening, Marzell. How can I be of service?" Sometimes Ed's chipper yet somehow monotone voice irritated Marzell, but maybe he was just hungry. "Make sure 10 down in the medbay knows to call for me the second it wakes up," Marzell ordered, propping his datapad up against the wall and leaning back in his chair. "As you have instructed, so shall it be done." With that, Ed blinked off of the screen, and Marzell was left to his own devices. Marzell set aside his emptied aluminum plate and leaned forward toward his datapad. His blunted claws scraped dully across the blue glass. He manually searched the records for anything relating to humans and found nothing. His search fruitless and his eyes throbbing, he pushed away the datapad and stood, hitting his head on the muted light that hung low over his desk. Grumbling and rubbing his head, he clambered back onto his rock ledge, rolling onto his back and wiggling out of his uniform. As he lay on his back and soaked up the warmth, he stared at the clock that hung, backlit, on his wall and cursed himself. The clock indicated that it was past the midnight period. He had mere hours before breakfast time. Groaning, he closed his eyes and let sleep overtake him. A pleasant blinging awoke him, his communicator letting him know that someone was trying to get his attention. A quick glance at the clock revealed that only 3.5 hours had passed. Marzell flopped off of the ledge and hurried over to his uniform that lay in a crumpled heap in the center of the mostly orderly room. He forced his arms into the sleeves and presses the button on his shoulder that accepted the correspondence. "Marzell here." He tried unsuccessfully to keep the grogginess out of his voice. "I have been calling for 20 minutes. "What have you been doing?" came the irritated and tired-sounding voice of Tend. "Sleeping. What did you think I was doing?" Marzell sputtered as his brain kicked into gear. "Why are you calling at this hour? Has it woken up?" Marzell growled, stepping out of his door and stomping toward the medbay. "Of course it hasn't. I've been doing surgery for 7 hours, Tend said, which explained the exhaustion evident in his voice. 7 hours, Marzell exclaimed. Why in the hells has it taken 7 hours to lop off its leg? Everything is wrong with it. I'm not in the mood. Just get down here, all right? I had to go old school, couldn't save its arm. Marzell hurried. For a creature that seemed so determined to survive, the human was making it really difficult for Ten to help. The only security he had to contend with was automated ones. It always puzzled him why HQ insisted that so much security be assigned to each vessel. Nobody was up, aside from the occasional grumpy-looking engineer repairing difficult-to-reach systems, or the occasional night shift officer managing systems. Marzell found himself almost sprinting to the medbay and skidded slightly as he came to a stop at the door of the atrium. As he reached to open it, Ten preempted his gesture and diverted one of his 4 arms to manually open the door from the inside. "He's in the private room," Ten said, standing from his desk and leading the way, knowing what Marzell would be asking. The medbay was quiet. Marzell was proud of the fact that nobody had ever been mortally wounded under his command, and the injury record was neat and orderly for the diverse. The quiet warbling hum of dozens of medical instruments was the only sound as Ten walked out of the doorway that led to his quarters and receptionist's desk. Marzell followed closely as Ten walked the 30-ish feet to the partitioned-off operation room. The window was dimmed for privacy, so Marzell didn't know the extent of the damage until he was standing beside the bed the human lay on. It had been clothed in a small hospital bottom designed to remove waste and monitor body temperature. Its left leg and arm were missing. The stumps were covered in synthetic polyester cloths. A respirator was fastened firmly to its pale, predatory-looking face. In the corner, visible now as the light flooded the room, was its garments, its severed appendages likely already incinerated or spaced. A silerating saw wouldn't break its skin or cut its muscle. Plasma cutting tools too violently cauterized its flesh. It's a wonder our clotting agents worked on the poor thing. All of Ten's forearms were occupied with typing on 2 separate datapads. "What could you gather about it?" Marzell asked, unable to take his eyes off of the human, watching the weak, halting rise and fall of its chest. "In the grand scheme, not much. I know it's carbon-based. I know it's apparently a human. I know it's a male, and its biology is all backward. It doesn't have any natural weapons or apparent defenses. Aside from the leathery skin, it's unprotected. Sorry, I'm not very articulate. It has been a long cycle. That's something at least. Before we knew nothing, aside from the fact that it's a human." "Was Ed of any help?" Marzell asked, diverting his attention from the unconscious human to the two-tone reddish vac suit it had been wearing. "Of course, he wasn't. Ed only helps when he wants to." Ten sounded long-suffering. Ed liked to play favorites sometimes with the crew, and now he was the man of the hour. The suit hovered in the localized anti-gravity ray Ten used to touchlessly examine medical objects of import. Under closer inspection, Marzell realized that the vac suit was two-tone by choice. Its gray latex and carbon fiber material was stained red on the torso and left arm and leg. The 2 orange belt-like devices hovered beside the vac suit. Marzell studied devices for a moment. "What are these things?" Marzell asked, pointing. "Oh, the tourniquets. Those things are ancient and outdated as method of stopping a serious bleed. They have a nasty side effect of completely cutting off the circulation of blood. They were barely an anecdote in my textbooks." "Why would it choose such a drastic measure to save itself?" Marzell asked, an obvious question in his tone. "Can we not bother me with these unanswerable questions? It's very late. All I wanted to accomplish was give you this report for the meeting you promised tomorrow." Ten said, one of his appendages twisting around to hand Marzell a datapad. Marzell had forgotten all about the meeting, which was really an announcement he had promised in a hurry to satiate the crew outside the medbay hours earlier. He hissed in displeasure as he took the datapad. It was clear that the interaction was over by the fact that Ten didn't turn around or say anything else. Marzell took his leave and started trudging back toward his quarters to cobble together something worthy of an esteemed captain. In the short time Marzell had, he worked madly, poring over the report Ten had drafted up and synthesized an announcement. It wasn't something pretty, but it covered all the necessary bases, focusing mainly on the revelation that the human wasn't a new species, as well as its current condition. He knew Mort and a team of engineers were down on the ship, examining the computers and the engines for anything that might be of use. Marzell glanced at his clock and sighed. He muted it immediately after it started to ring. He stuffed the datapad his notes were written on and stepped out. The diverse got attached to things alarmingly quickly. Pack bonding was a promising sign that the crew was accepting of everyone and had overwritten their genetic hardwiring. Unfortunately, in situations like this, where the thing they had pack bonded with something that could be destroyed or left behind at the whims of command, it proved a challenge. At every turn, Marzell found the prying eyes of the crew boring holes into his head as he walked by. He elected to skip the morning meal and head straight for the bridge and its trusty PA system. Grimp was nowhere to be found, and neither was Mort. The investigation must have gone on all night long. Marzell waved his hands and the packed bridge fell silent. All of you know by now of the alien retrieved from the wrecked ship. Many of you are excited about the implications of discovering a new species. Unfortunately for those particular crew members, I have disheartening news. Marzell paused to glance around at the crew members that weren't doing a good job at hiding the fact that they were straining their ears, both external and internal, to hear every word. The alien is not a new species. Ed has informed our medical officers that the alien is called a human, an apparently primitive race of predators that make their home here in the Sol system. The individual apprehended is a male, between 14 and 17 years. It is, in the words of Tend, unlikely that the individual will survive, so do not get up your hopes. The crew groaned but quickly stifled it. Command may decide that whatever reason the humans slipped from the eye of history is reason enough to keep them there and order its termination. There is also the matter of its unknown attackers. I have decided that we will not be spending any additional time in the vicinity of the ship for fear of meeting the unknown attackers. The aftermath of their attacks was disturbing. I'll let you know more when I know. That quip had become a platitude with how often Marzell used it. Political tensions were high, and many were worried for their livelihoods and families. Marzell took his finger off of the transmit button and glanced back at the crew, who were making a point to not look at Marzell. The crew had a myriad of tasks to perform now after the incognito orders from Marzell. He needed to find Grimp. Grimp always knew what to say in difficult situations like this. Marzell was good at navigating tense situations with boring, full-of-themselves bureaucrats, but had a hard time on occasion dealing with the feelings and opinions of the crew at large. Matters constantly demanded his attention, matters that couldn't be solved from the relative discomfort of his unpadded captain's chair. Marzell stood and rubbed his eyes and went to find Grimp for a counseling session. A strange emotion boiled up in his chest. He had vowed to retain his detachment from the emotional attachment the crew was so prone to. He wanted to remain neutral. It was a logical argument he had pressed to keep Ed around, and it would be a logical argument he put forth for the human. Marzell found Grimp in the common room, hunched over a gray plate of the brownish slop the ration synthesizers produced. Marzell felt no inclination to eat, so he just slid onto a chair across from Grimp. The room was empty aside from the two, all the crew having likely already eaten and retreated to their respective posts to discuss the announcement. "I need your advice, Grimp," Marzell said in a low voice. He didn't know why he lowered his voice. There was nobody to overhear them. "As you often do. It's about the announcement, right? Need to know how to approach this so it doesn't bite you in the ass later." "Yeah, I get the feeling that the second 10 discharges the human he'll be bombarded with crew members wanting a piece of it." Marzell nodded as he said this. Grimp knew him well. "It may be out of HQ's hands already. No doubt the Galactic Council will hear about the rediscovery of the humans almost as soon as we slip into warp. Luckily for us, we have a reputation for producing good things, and that may sway votes in our favor, or you're blowing this out of proportion, and the intergalactic community will be overjoyed at the rediscovery of a once-lost race." Grimp spoke as if the latter was the more likely solution, and that Marzell was absurd for thinking anything else. "Why, yeah, you're right. It's been way too many late nights and close shaves." "We did a good thing, right?" Marzell asked, anxiously licking his eyes. "PSSH, course you did. You rescued a helpless individual from a sinister fate. To have left him there and ignored him would have been gross misconduct," Grimp said as he clapped a hand onto Marzell's shoulder. "Go get some rest, all right? I'll manage things here okay." Marzell nodded and stood. It had been more than 40 hours or 1.54 cycles since he had gotten a full night's rest, and he could feel it in his bones. His movements felt sluggish, and his thoughts seemed dull, as if his brain were encased in sap. He felt his awareness slip into the gray as again he crossed the threshold of his quarters. He didn't bother to slide out of his uniform, and crawled up onto the slate outcropping on which he slept, eyes blinking shut and consciousness fading to nothing. Just before he slipped into sleep, he muttered, "Ed, engage the maglocks, will you? I need to sleep." "Of course, sir." Marzell knew no more. Sir, I think you'd best wake." Marzell was aware of a chill. He regretted not engaging his heating system. The human has awoken, and is none too pleased. The human has awoken, and is none too pleased. Damn it, Ed, every time. Marzell groaned. He supposed that rest would have to wait, again. "Not every time. I didn't choose to find a human," said Ed's slightly warbling voice. Marzell always thought himself a popular captain, but now he found that notion challenged. Instead of polite waves or cheery greetings from the crew members on his way to the medbay, all that he received was a cold indifference. He guessed it was the mention of the Federation getting involved that set them off, not to mention the likely loss of supplemental pay. Federal policy had been becoming more and more unpopular as of late, with embargoes and tariffs aplenty that only made it harder for private companies leased to federal organizations. Nobody liked the lack of autonomy private companies like theirs had, or the slight nudges to become government-owned. Others were playing with a closed hand, wanting to see what the human was, and how it would react. Some likely believed it was what had wiped out the crew of the ship. Marzell was stubborn, though, and set in his ways. He refused out of pride to do the obvious thing and ask the computer for help. Ego sometimes caused problems for the hulking reptilian. Marzell liked to draw upon his own wealth of experience when faced with a problem, only reaching for others when he had exhausted all other options. The diverse was an anomaly. It allowed the crew to vote, sometimes on what they believed to be the best course of action. A potential crewmate fugitive, unfortunately, fell under the jurisdiction of public affairs. He focused on his footsteps and not the growing mob of crew members outside the medbay who'd heard of the human waking up. Marzell stepped into the medbay, passing Matt and Pat and worming through the crowd. He became aware of a higher-pitched squeaking cry. Muffled as it was coming from the sectioned-off privacy room, the human was kept in. Tend was outside the door, clutching his bloodied hand. "I got here as quickly as time allowed. What happened to your hand?" Marzell asked. The urgency forbade him to pant with the exertion of walking in warp. "It panicked and bit me." Went to take off his respirator, and he just... Tend dropped off the sentence and gestured with his hand. "Why is it making that noise? Does it not know our charitable intent?" Marzell asked, with a hiss of distaste. "No idea. Ed isn't being much help at this time. Said he is only answering to you." "It must have hurt itself, or at least agitated its wounds," Marzell said, tentatively ignoring the quip about Ed as he cleared up the window and looked into the room. It had felt so frail. The human had fallen off of the bed. Tend had put it on when he operated on its arm and leg. The tangle of cables and tubes attached to the human and the waste removal apparatus seemed to Marzell like a net that had caught a fish. For how small the human was, it produced an absurd amount of noise. It must have disproportionate lungs. Gradually, because the human could no longer see the aliens, it started to calm down and turned its attention to freeing itself from the perceived shackles. Its eyes were wide and flighty, and the stump of its left arm moved as if it were directing its arm to rip out the tube in its other arm. When that fails, its shoulders slacken, and the human paused before biting down and yanking the IV tube out with its mouth. "I don't think so. Look at how quickly it's recovering. Not even the regenerative species can shrug off amputation quite like that." Tend was in wonder. It was clear he'd never seen anything like it. Perhaps its species had extraordinarily potent fear chemicals. Marzell gestured at the human, which looked rather lopsided and was currently just laying on the floor helplessly. Exhaustion had clearly limited the length and ferocity with which it could try to escape. Maybe Tend had attended to his injured digit and was moving toward the door separating him and the human. "Wait, I don't know if it will take well to a being it had attacked touching it. We can question Ed and try to get some answers later while we wait for Mort," Marzell said, putting a hand on Tend's shoulder. "Poor thing has to be exhausted. I'll be careful." Marzell walked into the room the human was in, and it froze. The human was caught in such a way that it couldn't see Marzell or the door. Marzell gently stooped to pick the human up and lay it down on the bed. When he picked it up, he did so in a way that trapped its arm against Marzell's chest. The human was laid down too quickly for it to bite Marzell, and stared at him with bulging eyes as Marzell backed out of the room. Marzell stepped away from the viewing port, which darkened as the computer sensed his departure. Despite Marzell's determination to remain unattached, he felt a strange emotion stir when he gazed at the human. He had no doubt in his mind that there would be unpleasant ramifications should the bureaucrats that sat above him on the totem pole decide to sweep the human under the rug. He doubted that his influence or his record would keep the crew alive and employed if the crew voted to disobey a potential order. Safe to say the cheery atmosphere of promised bonuses and renown was long behind the diverse. Complete silence had befallen as Marzell brooded, and the human gave up with noisemaking. Marzell and Ten were the only ones there for the time being. It wouldn't stay that way for long. Marzell seemed to feel himself come out of a mental fog, as if the contact with the human had finally made him abandon his pride. Despite all of the breaches of code and potentially disastrous situation brewing on their doorstep, Marzell was determined to hold on to some sense of order. He was acutely aware of the crew that was likely leaving their posts abandoned to discuss the upcoming vote. It wasn't the preferred outcome, the deserting of posts, but he really only had the power they gave to him. If everyone on the ship refused to fulfill their duties, there really wasn't much he could do. Marzell wasn't a tyrant. "Ed!" Marzell shouted. Marzell had finally swallowed his pride. "Yes, Marzell?" Ed replied dryly. "Please tell me about the human. Can you understand its speech?" Marzell said, hiding his face with his hand. Turgs hated asking for help. "PFFT, now you want my help?" Ed asked, a smile sounding in his voice. Marzell sighed. "Yes, I couldn't find anything on my own." Ten suppressed a grin. The four-armed medical professionals had worked with Marzell almost as long as Grimp and seemed to glean immense enjoyment from the Turg being brought low. Ed faked buffering. He already had the answers that Marzell sought, but wanted to make him wait for them. "The human speaks an extinct Terran language called Russian." Marzell raised his head, recognizing the name of the planet. "Terra? There isn't even a dominant species there. The closest thing that Death World has to sapience are its species of primates. Are you sure the human came from there?" Marzell challenged one last attempt at avoiding being dominated by Ed. "Yes," Ed stated simply and surely. "I guess that explains why none of our translators understood it." Marzell huffed. Their more modern computers had nothing on the human. Why did Ed? "Can you just translate its language? We need to be able to talk about it?" Marzell asked, hoping to steer the interaction away from his inexperience with humans. "Of course. Plug in an interface for a translator. I'll get it done for you." Marzell did as the computer said. The human was quiet mostly, aside from the occasional mutter or moan when it put pressure on the nubs of its appendages. Ed completed the addition of the language to the translator, and it blinked to life. Marzell walked over toward the sectioned-off room in which the human resided. Marzell remained outside the room as he glanced at the miniature shredded vac suit. He entered the characters on the deltoid areas of the suit's remaining arm and front, learning two things. 1. The name of the ship they had left behind was Freedom 2, and the human had the word Beregev on its vac suit sleeve. "What does Beregev mean?" Marzell asked into the open air. "Perhaps a name," Tend replied, equally as interested as Marzell. "Yes, Beregev doesn't have a definition that I can find. It must be a name." Ed agreed. "What about freedom? That number looks exactly like the character on the ship, so maybe that is the ship's name?" Marzell theorized. Marzell paused, trying to decide how to approach this. It likely saw them as threats. Hell, he didn't know if the humans had any knowledge of aliens. He decided to wait for Mort and bring the matter to the ruling executives of the ship. He didn't have to wait long. Mort hated that ship and had requested a reseating of the order to search the ship in more detail when his search yielded nothing. Marzell instead offloaded the data he had detailing what he knew. including that he had deciphered the human language, which did nothing as Mort found out it was not the same language that the systems of the ship were written in. Marzell figured that perhaps the humans had several different languages, and Ed confirmed his suspicions. With Freedom 2 providing no answers, Marzell ordered Mort to return. When Mort was safely aboard the diverse, Marzell pored over the report he provided, including the somewhat shocking discovery that several sections of the human computers had been purged, large sections of files were clearly missing, and diagnostics run by the crew of the diverse showed physical and technical tampering. This situation seemed to be determined to unravel in the most confusing manner possible. Marzell remotely ordered the diverse to leave the site of the destroyed Freedom 2. He wanted to gain as much information from the human as he could before it was released to the powers that be, and so selected the slowest route. Whether that power that be was command or directly to the Federation, he did not yet know. As he stood before his chief executive officers in the dedicated micro-council room, he made his decision. His vote was for the preservation of the human. We know its language now. How do we proceed with contact? How do we determine more information about the human, which we believe to be named Beregev? Marzell began the deliberation and directed a presentation on the big screen at the head of the table. Multiple different species were arranged around the oval-shaped table in the middle of the room. "Why even reveal ourselves at all?" piped up Volk, the egg-headed scientific advisor. "Where is your empathy? It's clearly a living thing. It needs something to befriend, something to latch onto. Besides, it already is aware of us." Came Tend. The medical practice had heightened both his feelings of sympathy and logic. "It's already shown itself to be hostile. Its first reaction was to bite you." Came Grimp. Irritable as always, Marzell knew now was the time he usually caught up on his books. "We can come back to that," Marzell interjected, sensing an argument. "What of the ship? Any theories as to what did that to the crew?" "The acid samples Mort brought back were unlike anything I've ever seen. Or well, they weren't quite acid. They seemed to be volatile bacteria that consumed the titanium outer hull of the ship with alarming speed. I ran some genetic tests and found it to be closely related to the species of bacteria that sometimes manifest on asteroid mines rich in titanium and lead. Except this strain can, for some reason, not survive long in spaces that lack atmosphere. There's viable speculation that has led me to believe that these bacteria were developed as a way to maintain some sense of political innocence. This wasn't a chance happening, nor an alien attack, as there are no registered deposits of any variant of this bacteria in the Sol system," Volk explained. Several heads nodded as Volk explained his findings and deductions. This couldn't have been the humans that did this to themselves. It had to be predatory ones at that. It would explain the missing corpses. Grimp voices the concerns displayed across the faces of several officers. "If it were pirates, why is data missing or expunged? It takes time to do that. Pirates would have just taken the whole computer and sold it." Grimp said, crossing his arms. "It had to be mutiny. Maybe the missing data displayed incriminating or illicit dealing the crew disapproved of." Mort chipped in. The engineer was one of the few who'd been allowed onto the ship. The pirates just arrived at an unfortunate time and boarded the ship because the humans didn't understand or reciprocate to their threats. Marzell mostly remained silent. This was the time reserved for the others in charge of the ship to voice their concerns and decide where their votes would be before the crew's opinions were tossed into the mix. He decided to wait until Mort had finished speaking before he asked Ed's opinion. "That seems logical," Marzell said slowly. "Ed, what do you know of human temperaments? Would they have mutinied? Would they have given in to the pirates?" Ed waited a while before speaking. "Humans are a species rumored to have at one time been prey that adapted predatory practices in order to survive. Based purely on that, no, they wouldn't have surrendered." Marzell shrugged. "Could be that stubbornness that angered the pirates enough to kill the escape pods. If it were predatory pirates, perhaps they harvested the corpses for food." "Sol is a barren system," Marzell said, glancing at Tend and Volk. Both of the officers nodded. Marzell felt some of the anxiety fade. They at least had their stories straight. Now came the resuming of the discussion of a much more uncomfortable matter, that of what to do with the human. Nobody said it, but everyone knew the shift in conversation topic and tone. Marzell guessed that the other officers had sensed the crew starting to view the human as one of their own. We at least owe it some stimulation. Keeping it cooped up like an animal is the wrong thing too, came Mort's small voice. As I said before, it's hostile. It has already bitten Tend, Grimp said, speaking over Mort and gesturing to the four-armed medical professional. It didn't do that maliciously. What would you do if you survived something like that and walk? Tend didn't get to finish his sentence because Ed surprised everyone and spoke without being called on. If I may? Thank you. The human is prepubescent, and the children of Terra are renowned for their ability to recover from tragedy. They've evolved from a death world. Death is a part of their daily lives. All we can hope to do is provide it broad courtesies, and show it through actions and not words that we are not going to hurt it. It'll come around. Ed paused as all eyes were fixed into thousand-yard stares. Ed heeded none of this and continued. A bipedal of similar size and skin composition would be best for first interaction, either that or a smaller furred species. Humans, especially their children, are drawn to things with fur due to their being raised around domesticated furry animals. No offense to all involved, but all it has seen is a 9-foot-tall hulking lizard and a wrinkly four-armed alien. Not exactly inviting things to wake up to after serious injuries. Ed was the only member of the crew that could get away with such blunt speech. We've only got 2 of those, Volk or one of the CH-Cat crew members. I am sure we won't be hard-pressed for volunteers. Then again, CH-Cats are a prey species. Came a new voice. Everyone turned to gaze at G-Vomp, the Trivilk who had spoken. It was decided that the human would be given an extra day before being moved into the more public area of the medbay. A CH-Cat would be found to try to break gently the news to the human and to move it to the general medbay area when the time came. It was also decided that the crew would have to wait for their vote. G-Vomp left the meeting quickly to ask individually each CH-Cat personnel if they would volunteer. The first CH-Cat G-Vomp asked responded positively before the Trivilk was even done speaking. Turk, a female CH-Cat, was instructed not to press matters if the human refused to answer. Turk was to attempt to get the human to not panic and lash out when it woke up in a different bed surrounded by members of the crew, or at least warn the human of the impending change. Turk was overjoyed to be the first crewman to get to meet the human, but was nervous. She had a hard time overcoming her natural wiring. It was different with Turgs, she explained to Marzell. Turgs had a gradual introduction, and there wasn't time with a human. When Marzell and Trey along with Tend and Grimp arrived in the medbay, the human had been changed into a hospital smock by the long autonomous metal arm that was attached to the ceiling of the room. It had long given up struggling and lay dead-eyed on the bed. Turk entered and stood beside the door. The human's eyes snapped to the shorter furred being. "Hello, is your name Beregev?" The translator was delayed, but the human's eyes brightened at the speaking of its own language. Beregev nodded but refused to speak. "My name is Turk. I'm going to walk over to you now," Turk said, holding her arms out to show her empty hands. Beregev edged away slightly as Turk approached, clearly still scared. "Would you like something to eat?" Turk asked, standing at the foot of Berejev's bed. He nodded. Beregev looked beyond Turk and at the mirror that Marzell, Tend, and Grimp stood behind, silently advising Turk on how to proceed. Ed advised them that humans usually engaged in some form of physical touch when meeting a new person. So, at Marzell's command, Turk reached out a paw and placed it atop Berejev's foot. Beregev snapped his attention back to Turk and flinched away, albeit limitedly, as his foot was under the tight blanket on the hospital bed. She subconsciously jerks her hand away at the sudden movement. Turk's face changes to one of sadness as she comprehends what had happened. She hadn't meant to startle the human. Berejev's face goes from fearful to empathetic. He'd expected pain from the touch and hadn't thought through the predatory dynamic. Beregev tried to reach out with his left arm, then huffed dejectedly when his residual limb flops up and down uselessly. The tuft of coarse red hair atop his head was matted due to all the time he had spent immobilized or in a helmet. He reached out with his hand toward Turk. Turk slowly walked over to the other side of the hospital bed, and with her back turned to the mirror, allowed the young human to touch her hand. "I came to let you know that they'll be moving you to the main part of the medbay today," Turk said through her translator. There is a pause, and something broke in Beregev's eyes. It was as if the touch solidified something in his mind. Berejev's bottom lip began to quaver slightly, and he looked away again, a thin, clear liquid sliding out of his eye. Turk didn't know what the reason for the reaction was and tilted her head, slightly confused. Berejev's hand slid away from Turk's own, and Turk backed out of the room, feeling it best to let the human be alone. Besides, she had promised it food and was determined to deliver. Marzell agreed with Turk's clear thought process as she left the room. He felt a slight moment of panic. Turk had promised the human food, and nobody knew what humans ate. Not even Ed, though I guessed that the human wouldn't care, as long as what it was given was edible. "I think you might have to be the one to move it to the public part of the medbay." Tend piped up to Turk. "I feel that might be best. It looked to have made some sort of connection. You might have to help it eat Turk." Turk nodded. Despite the prey nature of his species, she was delighted to be of use to her captain and ship. Marzell figured she would be the woman of the hour when she got back to the crew's quarters. Marzell watched as Turk scampered off excitedly toward the common area for the crew, no doubt going to synthesize something for the human, and to tell every ear that would listen. "Do we give it prosthetics? We don't have the latest cybernetics here on the ship. Do we even bother?" Tend asked, still standing before the darkened viewport of the human's room. "I would say yes. It's giving me the impression that it won't like the somewhat restrictive nature of a wheelchair. It keeps trying to use its detached limbs. Though I think we wait still. I hate all this waiting, but we don't want to overwhelm it. Teaching it how to use the more primitive tools available is an involved practice, if I am not mistaken," Marzell responded, remembering the look of disparity on Berejev's face when it had reached out to Turk with its residual limb. "You are not mistaken, that is. We'll have to limit crew access to the medbay, won't we?" Tend asked, glancing toward Grimp, who was the expert on those sorts of things. "Oh, of course. Let them interact in a limited fashion, but not overwhelm it. Even a weak predator is still a predator." Grimp replied gruffly. He hadn't spent nearly as much time watching the human. Marzell nodded as Turk came back in with a plate of the mush created by the synthesizer. Grimp stood and held out a hand to stop Turk before she went into the room. She looked at him with puzzlement on her face. "What's the holdup, sir?" Turk asked with skepticism. "Don't let it eat on its own. It needs to understand that we're in charge," Grimp said. "That may not be advisable," Tend and Ed piped up at the same time. "And why would that be?" Grimp drawled dryly. "From what my records indicate, food is a big deal for humans. Sometimes after traumatic events, most especially with prepubescent individuals such as ours, they will refuse food as their brain adjusts," Ed explained. "Yeah, it may be best to offer it food first and let it decide. If it lets itself be fed, then feed it. If not, we'll give it time and then move it in the evening. Let it get acquainted in the relative safety of darkness." Tend explained. It seemed to Marzell demeaning to speak of the human as if it were nothing more than a soulless automaton, but that was their situation. Marzell watched Turk walk in and assume her place slightly away from the human. His mood was oddly tense, and a crippling worry bubbled in his mind. His job was to protect his crew. He did not yet know if the human posed a threat. He knew physically there wasn't much it could do, but it was the people above him in authority that could. He strangely found a smile playing across his face as he watched the human allow Turk to help it sit up and feed him. Tend sighed in relief and walked into his office reception area to write up a report. Marzell followed, turning to the side to fit through the narrow door. Tend gestured for Marzell to sit, and he did, suppressing a groan as he squeezed into the inadequately sized chair. Something tells me Beregev won't like the restrictive nature of motorized transportation, Marzell said, eyes fixated on the four-armed medical man. I am not sure he will have a choice. If it comes out that we used valuable resources to synthesize prosthetics for Beregev, and the order to axe him gets green-lighted, it will be everything but good for us. Tend replied, looking up from his writing. I don't know, this whole ordeal is Ed. I've never dealt with stuff like this. The human parts specifically, I've dealt with the feds before. Marzell said, massaging the ridges above his eyes. Tend didn't respond. There wasn't anything he felt he could add to benefit the conversation. Some of the tension had abated when the human ate, but now it was mounting again. Marzell hid in the room with Tend for a while as he formulated a plan of attack. Not an attack against any individual, but an attack against the circumstances he found himself in. His thoughts composed, Marzell left Tend alone. They'd decided beforehand to waive the suggested curfew to give the crew time to meet Beregev. All that was left was for Marzell to do was announce that sign-ups for the first crew to meet Beregev were open on a first-come, first-served basis. Marzell was stopped in the hallway before he reached the bridge by one of the technicians he'd seen that morning as he went to the medbay. Sir, the technician greeted Marzell and saluted. Go ahead, Marzell said, returning the salute. Mort instructed me to inform you that he has requested an audience with you. Said that it was urgent. The techie said, staring into Marzell's eyes. Thank you. You're dismissed. Marzell saluted, and the technician darted away in the opposite direction. Marzell pondered the meaning of the requested meeting. Nothing he knew of was wrong with the ship, and Mort was not one for friendly chats. He ventured down into the hot belly of the ship, just above the massive maglocks designed to haul the containers of cargo. As he ventured downward, he found himself stooping lower and lower to fit inside the progressively smaller passageways and halls. The bowels of the ship were designed to accommodate the smaller average size of the races that took up technical jobs. Marzell had to crawl through the door that led to Mort's office. Dozens of panels of bleeping machinery greeted Marzell. The flashing lights made him squint. With difficulty, Marzell navigated the maze of whirring machinery until Mort called out to him. Ah, Marzell. Glad you got down here so fast. I need access to the human vac suit. When I saw it, I noticed that it had an object that looks suspiciously like a camera on its helmet. If I could figure out how to access it, perhaps it may provide insight into freedom's final hours. You're the man upstairs after all. Mort said, appearing from behind a column of computers. Marzell jumped. Sleep deprivation atop the biting tension he felt had made him flighty. Mort, you know you shouldn't pop out like that. Marzell paused to listen to Mort's request. Take it up with Tend. He's the individual that oversees the medical side of the ship. If he refuses for some absurd reason, you can take it up with me. Marzell crossed his arms and looked down at the officer. You know Tend. He's protective of what he thinks is his. All right. Sorry for bothering you. Mort bowed and backed up a step. It is never a bother to serve my crew, Marzell said as he turned for the door. Marzell took a moment to survey his datapad and panicked slightly as he realized the time. He hurried his pace toward the bridge. He had to hurry up and update the crew before Tend and Turk moved the human. Warp always made the bridge unusually warm. It was situated above the engine, and the constant chemical reactions caused heat to radiate up and into it. Marzell loved it. It made him sleepy. He sat down heavily in his captain's chair and pulled up the screening arm and pulled up the limited notes he'd prepared beforehand and pressed the button to begin broadcasting on the ship-wide PA system. Attention. This is Marzell speaking. I am acutely aware of the hushed conversations you all are having. I am speaking to you all now to alleviate the worry or excitement you may be feeling. The human, who we have learned is called Beregev, will be moved this evening to the general area of the medbay. Sign-ups to visit him will be open at this time with Tend. Thank you for bearing with me in these difficult times. That is all. For a moment there is a squeal of feedback, then a click as Marzell takes his finger off of the button. Marzell became aware that all the eyes on the bridge were on him. He found that he didn't like the way they looked at him. like a mob of sharks, waiting for a weakness. The better part of him knew it wasn't like that. His instincts occasionally interpreted meaningless things in hostile ways. Marzell was determined to rest his weary bones. Marzell instructed Grimp to take over again and regretfully left the warm, dark room. He walked the well-known route to his quarters, passing more than a dozen sailors hurrying toward the medbay. Everyone wanted a piece of it. A thought wormed its way into Marzell's mind. Perhaps the adage was correct. Nobody would ever satisfy, not even if you had it all. Then again, the crew could just be deciding if they liked the human. New things always had a strange allure to them. New things were scary, but enchantingly so. Marzell made sure that nobody would bother him when the cabin door closed behind him. His species was not designed for endurance. He could have sworn he was seeing things. Days without consistent sleep had done a serious number on the Turg. It was a wonder he could stand and form sentences without slurring his words. Marzell was so exhausted that when he was out of sight of the crew his breath started coming in heaving scraggly gasps. He collapsed onto his ledge, not bothering to remove his unwashed uniform. Soundly he slept, confident in his decisions, and strangely in the human. Turk had walked quietly into the room the human was in. A close inspection revealed that Beregev had fallen asleep. Turk sighed, pangs of sympathy spiking in her heart. She set the food on the bedside table and went to walk out. A stirring from the human prompted her to stay. Berejev's face was red and flushed as he turned to look at her. She approached and said, "I've brought you something to eat," she said, gently picking up the plate and gesturing with it. Beregev still said nothing, but a ferocious wildfire lit in his eyes. It scared Turk a little. "Would you like me to help you eat?" she asked with a gulp. She pressed her ears against her head and bounced from foot to foot. Beregev nodded and tried to sit up. "Here, let me help," Turk said as she used the electric motor to raise the back half of the bed Beregev was lying in so that he sat up. Beregev still seemed skeptical and slowly reached out with his right hand for Turk, as if he were making sure this wasn't a hallucination. Turk wondered the reason behind Beregev wanting to hold on to her. She would have to ask Ed. She correctly guessed that Beregev would provide no insight. She took his hand and perched herself in the gap left by his missing leg. She found that even in his weakened state, he still had enough strength to firmly grip her smaller hand. Almost cautiously she offered spoonfuls of the brownish-gray slop. She guessed it didn't taste very good. She didn't know. Cats couldn't taste flavors, just the ability to taste the strength of foods. Berejev's face had a note of satisfaction on it similar to that of a young cat who had just nursed that Turk found comforting. It gladdened her heart to know that even in the strenuous situation he found himself in that he was able to glean some modicum of enjoyment from this interaction. She wished he would talk. Turk thought that the human had many interesting things to say. They quickly established a rhythm. Turk offered food, and he ate the food and gave her hand a little squeeze when he was ready for more. Turk broke the rhythm when she noticed something on Berejev's upper arm. A square-ish scar similar to a burn marred the skin of his arm. It was such an odd place to be injured that she puzzled over it before finally asking, "What is that, on your arm?" The look of contentment immediately slid from Berejev's face, and he stared at her, facing her, but not seeing her. He let go of her hand, though didn't seem to notice. Turk took note of the shift in body language and facial expression and dropped the matter, offering another spoonful saying, "Never mind, I'm sorry." He turned up his nose at the food. No longer interested, Turk felt sorry and reached out for his hand, discarding the spoon. Beregev flinched away from her touch, then gave his head a little shake and took her hand again, gaze softening. Turk took note of his tired eyes and hopped off the side of the bed she sat on. She tried to let go of his hands, but he refused to let go. She reciprocated and stayed, holding on to his hand as he fell asleep. It filled her with a maternal sense of pride. Beregev trusted her enough to let himself be helpless and defenseless as he slept. Once his hand went limp, she backed away and slipped out the door. Tend was there waiting for her. Marzell had left. Would probably be best to move him when he wakes. Might disorient him to be moved while he sleeps. I'll send for to you when he starts to wake up. He may like to think you stayed with him, protected him, or something." Ten drawled, staring at the screen displayed on which was Beregev's vitals. "Of course, sir. So as you say, shall it be done?" Turk saluted and headed out the door. A spring works its way into Turk's step as she heads toward her dorm. She was delighted to be the center of attention. She had 28 siblings, and her parents didn't often have time to devote to each one. The Diverse was the venue that Turk used to make a name for herself away from her overcrowded home. The second she opened the door of the barracks, she was bombarded with questions. She slipped into her room in the area where cats made their beds. Turk had somehow managed to avoid the brunt of the questions that the crew had bombarded her with. Orgino knocked politely on Turk's door frame. "Turk, how was it? Tell me about it. I told everybody that they'll get their chance tomorrow," Orgino said brightly. Orgino is Turk's best friend. Orgino was somehow smaller than Turk and spoke with a soft, breezy voice. She had gray-colored fur, larger than average eyes, and a shorter tail indicating her youth. Turk was happy to share with her friend first, and guessed everyone in the barracks had their ears pressed against the wall to listen to their conversations. "I think he'll be a nice addition to the crew. He likes to hold hands," Turk explains, gesturing for Orgino to sit across from her. "It's a he? What did he look like?" "What's his name?" Orgino said, barely able to contain herself. Oh, his name's Beregev. He was hurt when he came into the medbay. Tend had to cut off one of his arms and one of his legs." Turk paused to flick her tail, guessing that Orgino already knew Beregev's name from Marzell's announcement. "Why would they do that?" Orgino exclaimed. "Amputate? As I said, he was hurt. He put some belt thing called a tourniquet. It killed the tissue of his arms and legs. At least that is what Tend said. I don't know what a tourniquet is or why it would do that," Turk said, not liking to talk about the pain of others. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," Orgino said, picking up on Turk's discomfort. "Tell me about what he looked like." "He's really small. Well, he's taller than I am, but small. I don't think he had much to eat on his ship. He's got red-colored hair, like Pat's scales, and his eyes. I've never seen anything like them," Turk explained slowly at first, then getting more and more animated as she spoke. "He sounds adorable. I can't wait to see him. I signed up to be one of the first to meet him," Orgino said, leaning forward, glad the conversation went forward. Turk and Orgino's conversation was ended abruptly by Tend radioing Turk. "He's waking up. I need you back here, now please." Tend was irritable and rushed. "Of course, I've got to go. I think Beregev likes me, I think," Turk said, rushing out and back toward the medbay, grabbing one of her uniform shirts as an afterthought. There was yet again a queue outside the medbay. Turk pushed her way to the head of the line and entered the atrium. Tend was accepting applications for the sign-ups to meet Beregev when Turk moved him. "Head right through. He's probably awake. Damned excitable crew held you up, I'm guessing?" Tend growled and called for the next. Of course, Turk moved past Matt and Pat and into the main part of the medbay. Grimp sat in the medbay gazing at the viewing window. "Oh, thank the powers above. Hurry, I don't want an incident," Grimp said, opening the door for the cat. Turk entered hurriedly. She'd managed to snag a spare shirt of hers that looked close to the human size. His eyes were bleary. Hopefully, he hadn't noticed that she was gone. She stood close-ish to Beregev. Turk noticed that Tend had provided a wheeled chair to make it easier for her to help him move. Most of the trays on stands had been cleared out now that they weren't needed anymore. "Hey there, Beregev, did you sleep well?" Turk stammered out, suddenly realizing she had no idea what to say to a human who was waking up. The noise of the voice seemed to inject clarity into Berejev's face. His deep electric blue eyes slid into focus, and he stared at Turk. "I've brought you a shirt. I thought maybe the hospital clothes were cold, and besides, you're part of the crew. Need a uniform to be on the ship," she said in a joking manner. Berejev's focus remains fixed upon Turk as she speaks. Turk held out the shirt for a while, then realized her mistake and moved her hand down back to her side. She moved to the side of the bed that Beregev lay on. He reached again for her hand, and she took it gently. It was as if he were making sure she knew he was paying attention. "Do you want me to help you put it on? Or would you like to try to do it yourself?" Turk asked gently. "I've got to move you when you get finished." Beregev looks from the shirt to Turk, then back to the shirt. He still doesn't speak. It was beginning to look like he'd never speak. Turk pressed the button again to raise the bed so that Beregev was sitting up. She avoids touching the stump of his arm as she holds the shirt open for him to put his arm into it. She keeps a loose hold of it as she walks around the back of the bed. There wasn't much arm to put into the sleeve on the left side. Turk used the pauldron strap to tie up the useless sleeve. As Turk helped Beregev, he stared with awe at her brownish fur and large ears. It was as if he expected her to drop the act and hit him. She didn't make any move to do anything remotely like hurting Beregev and stepped back to admire how he looked. The reds complemented his hair nicely, she thought. She didn't make any move to suggest it, but he looked like a proper member of the crew. She hoped that maybe he'd realize that he was safe. "You look like a proper sailor. Are you ready to move?" Beregev lay still as he grasped the slightly too long sleeve. It was as if he didn't want to move, but then he nodded. Turk smiled and moved toward the wheeled chair in the corner of the room. It squeaked slightly as she rolled it to the right side of his bed. His analytical gaze never left her as he tracked her every movement. He swung his leg over the side and overextended. He yelped and started to fall forward with no left arm to catch himself. Turk was there to stop it though, and he put his right arm around her. She hadn't quite expected the exchange to end with her having to move him so suddenly. Cats weren't renowned for their strength. Luckily for her, Beregev didn't weigh much, and she didn't have to move him far. The momentum was directed downward, and he plops onto the chair with a huff. He looked really uncomfortable, as if he was not at all used to being helped by anyone. Beregev immediately started trying to roll himself around, but only went in kind of a weird lopsided circle. "It's got a motor. Here, let me." She flipped a switch on the panel on the armrest. "Just move the joystick." The words died in her throat as she realized the joystick was on the left side. "On second thought, I'll just push you." Turk flipped the switch off as Berejev's shoulders slumped again. Turk cringed, thinking to herself that Beregev would likely never get used to his missing parts. Turk berated herself as she pushed Beregev toward the door, which Grimp opened from the other side. Beregev tensed, and he gripped the armrest of the wheelchair so tight that his knuckle popped. Turk guessed he hated feeling helpless, especially around big Xenos. She stopped the wheelchair at a bed that Tend had made up for Beregev. Turk hated that the hospital sheets were made of an itchy fabric and resolved to get him something more comfortable. Beregev this time was at least prepared to be picked up and accepted it. Grimp and Turk bent down to pick him up and lay him on the bed. His eyes widen when he can't see Grimp, but he remains calm and keeps his eyes on Turk. His right arm flops uselessly away. He seemed frozen. His eyes locked with Turk's with a pained expression, and she spoke. "Could you be more gentle? You're scaring him." Turk reached and held out her hand for Beregev to take it again, but he didn't. "I'll be however I decide with him. Don't let his eyes fool you. He's just looking for an opening." Grimp put the emphasis on eyes. Turk guessed that Grimp had deduced her infatuation with Berejev's deep emotional eyes. Turk put her hand back at her side when Beregev doesn't take it. She figured maybe he was angry at her for allowing Grimp to touch him and cowered. It took a concentrated effort for her to pull up the blanket over Berejev's cold-looking feet. She wondered why the human didn't have a sleek fur coat to keep him warm. The medbay was cold and Beregev had started to shiver. Despite her new worry, she felt honor-bound to defend the human. As Grimp walked away back to the chair in the corner of the room, she retorted from the corner of her mouth. "No, he isn't. PFFT, you'll eat your words. He may not do anything, but the feds will." Grimp sat down and returned to his brooding. Beregev was not paying attention to what the two aliens were saying. He couldn't speak their language. Turk went back to the left side of Berejev's bed and sat down again. The gap left by Beregev's leg was the perfect size for Turk to put her own paw up on the bed, and she did so, taking Beregev's hand again. He didn't grip her hand back. She'd fallen asleep in a chair next to Beregev's bed and didn't wake until the sound of voices became unbearable. She stood and her back crackled. Grimp was nowhere to be found. Her eyes fell onto the glass viewing window where 6 or 7 of her crewmates were lined up watching the human. She started to walk toward them, but felt Beregev's hand brush her coattails. When she turned around to look at him, she saw such a look of crippling fear. She looked away to avoid showing weakness. "Wait, please stay," Beregev said, voice cracking with disuse. "Wait, please stay," Beregev said, voice cracking with disuse. For a moment, Turk did not realize who had spoken and glanced from side to side, trying to determine where the noise had come from before realizing it was Beregev who had spoken. Turk stopped walking and remained by Berejev's bed looking at his flushed face. Slowly, he reached out for her hand again. Turk took it to comfort him. He held tightly, almost painfully, onto Turk's hand and stared with fearful eyes at the window. The crew stared at him from. "Of course, I'll stay right here," Turk said after her brain kicked into gear, forcing steel into her voice. "Okay," Beregev said, taking a deep, steadying breath. "Are you ready to meet the crew? They're excited." Turk exhaled smoothly. Beregev nodded, but he looked unsure. The first of the crew quietly padded into the room as Beregev nodded. Turk thanked her lucky stars that Tend had the sense to limit the visitors to single digits. Only 7 other sailors aside from Turk were crowded around Berejev's bed. They all gazed down upon him with muted, curious expressions. 2 other CH-Cats, 2 Trivolks, 1 of Volk's kinsmen, and 2 of the Lopins that loaded the turret below the bridge stood in silence around Beregev. Turk deduced that Tend had selected crew members that looked the least intimidating to make the process easier on the young human. Berejev's gaze lingered on the Lopins, who appeared to be the simplest of the Xenos assembled before him. It was Orgino who spoke first. "You were right. His eyes, they're so blue." She subtly reached out her hand as if to touch them. "How'd you lose your leg?" piped up Volk's kin, as if they'd been waiting for someone else to speak first. "Are there any more of you?" came a question from one of the Lopins that Turk didn't know the name of. The joints of Turk's hand crunched as Beregev gripped her hand tighter and looked from person to person, stammering, "Ooh." Turk would have laughed at how childlike the motley conglomeration of individuals looked if her hand wasn't being crushed. Their eyes were wide and bright with curiosity. Beregev jerked his head away from Orgino's hand as it inched closer and closer to his face. Orgino yelped and snatched her hand back like a child after being snapped at by a dog. She was unshaken in her resolve and remained with a fiery passion. Whoa, let's pace ourselves, okay? He's scared. Start with telling him your name." Turk made sure that her translator spat her words out in Russian so that Beregev understood. "You first," she said, pointing to Orgino and worming her hand out of Berejev's crushing grasp. "I'm Orgino," Orgino said softly, pointing to herself. "I'm Style," came the other CH-Cat lightly. "I'm Bomb," the female Trivolk spoke. "I'm Darren," the other Trivolk said, wavering. "Macaire," Volk's kinfolk piped up, almost hidden by the beefy Lopins that stood at the foot of Berejev's bed. "Bork, and he's Spack," the larger of the 2 Lopins said, pointing to the other, who didn't say much. The reduced pace Turk suggested worked, and Beregev relaxed. Turk could feel Grimp's narrowed eyes staring lasers at Beregev, watching for the slightest slip or sudden movement. Berejev's uniform matched the uniforms of the crew that crowded around him. Orgino commented on how it complemented his hair. Beregev at first seemed to shirk the attention, but as the 7 asked him questions, he gradually lightened up. At a request by Bomb, Beregev held out his hand so that the Trivolks and CH-Cats could touch it. They had at first believed that his skin was slimy and was relieved to find out that it wasn't. Beregev spoke little at first, answering questions hastily with as few words as possible. That was until Bork repeated his question about there being any more humans. Beregev's bottom lip began to quiver and the thin, clear liquid began to leak from his eyes, which he closed and rubbed with the back of his hand. Turk smiled awkwardly and looked at the crew, who shuffled uncomfortably. She took Berejev's hand again and waved with her other hand, dismissing the crew. "I think he is finished. You all will need to come back soon." Turk was not used to people listening to her and seemed surprised when the 7 obeyed and backed out, sheepishly fiddling with their hands. Again, Turk and Beregev were left alone in the medbay. Turk took her leave from Beregev as Tend entered the room. Turk nodded to Tend and walked over as Beregev made heaving, coughing sounds. Turk knew deep down that Beregev was distressed and wanted to comfort him, but she didn't know how. His moods were infectious. When he was happy, she was happy. Turk was so absorbed in her thoughts that she missed Tend speaking. "How many more can he deal with?" Tend repeated. "What?" Turk asked, coming back to reality. "Can he meet more of the crew?" Tend said, pausing after each word. "Oh no, I think he needs some time. He's distressed," Turk explained, though Tend probably knew this. "I don't know if we have more time. We arrive back in federal space in less than a day. Marzell is preparing his brief for the council as we speak. We'll need to vote after that," Tend frustratedly explained. It seemed he was frustrated a lot lately. He must be molting. "I don't know what to tell you. Their brains must not deal with trauma well. He's terrified," Turk retorted, feeling a little ornery and protective. Tend muttered incoherently as he walked toward Beregev, all 4 hands on his hips. Beregev didn't seem to notice his approach. He was too absorbed in his mind. Turk followed, gently putting a hand on Berejev's leg. "Hey Beregev, it's okay. You don't have to meet anyone else. We can leave you alone if you'd like," Tend said, trying to comfort Beregev, or at least calm him down. No, I want to see them," Beregev exclaimed harshly, making Turk and Tend jump. "I don't want to be alone." Turk realized that Beregev was avoiding dealing with his emotions. He must have lost something important on freedom. It pained him. Was it good to enable him to distract himself? "Turk says that they hurt you," Tend said, recovering faster than Turk. "No, they can't hurt me," Beregev said cryptically. Berejev's mysterious statement stumped Turk, and Tend as well. Neither of them knew what he meant. They could hurt Beregev, but he provided no further insight. He was insistent that he be allowed to meet more of the crew. Turk relented. They'd cross the bridges of his mind later, when he could walk again. He protested against laying in the bed and having the crew come to him. He begged to be allowed to move, to go to them. So, Tend improvised a wheelchair that had a joystick on the right side, especially for Beregev. Turk helped Beregev into the wheelchair, and he was off. As fast as it could go was as fast as he went. He wheeled himself toward the door that led to the atrium. He looked back to the following Turk when inevitably the door didn't open, and patiently waited for her to open it. As soon as he could fit through the slow-opening yellow hydraulic doors, he urged the mechanical chair forward and toward the next door. Beregev went wherever the hallways led, and Turk followed, opening doors as needed. He passed meeting rooms and technicians repairing panels, and he eventually wound up rolling through the back door that led into the crew's quarters. He immediately was bombarded with questions, praise, and admiration. Whoa, settle down, everybody, don't overwhelm him," Turk exclaimed, stepping in front of Beregev and waving her hands at the crew. "It's okay, just one at a time?" Beregev asked, looking up at Turk inquisitively. Yeah, how do you want to do this?" Turk asked, not knowing how to feel. It seemed that the human did what it wanted. He hadn't provided any insight as to his plan. Beregev rolled himself deeper into the long rectangular dorm and stopped at a side door. "Where does this door lead?" Beregev asked the closest sailor. "It leads to the commons area," replied a trivolt called Tizan. "Can I go there?" Beregev asked, slowly inching toward the door. "Of course you can," Tizan gently replied. It didn't take long for a majority of the crew to cram themselves into the common eating area of the ship. Some Turk lifted Beregev and his wheelchair onto a table in the center of the room. Everyone crowded around him, anxiously awaiting him to speak. Beregev paused. Turk realized for effect before he said, "Hello, I'm Beregev." He didn't get to finish his sentence before someone asked, "How old are you?" "Oh, 16. 16 years, Beregev replied, seemingly relieved that he didn't have to make up interesting things to say. Several of the shorter-lived Trivolks gasped. 16 years was almost middle age for them. Yet Ed and Marzell said that Beregev was an adolescent. Beregev had the entire crew wrapped around his little skinny fingers. Right there in the crowded common room, the crew had an impromptu initiation ceremony. Someone appeared with a marker and etched Beregev onto his uniform. He was given the nickname Bear after the CHCAT word for one arm. Turk smiled as she watched Beregev come alive. She was glad that at last he had started letting his colors show. Marzell took a deep breath. He couldn't delay any longer. He had to speak to the Federation. He sat before his datapad at his desk in the privacy of his quarters. He'd assigned Turk to watch over Beregev. He was glad that at least one thing was going well. His room was dark as he awaited the summons. He'd slept soundly. Nobody had bothered him, and for that he was grateful. He'd had plenty of time to prepare for the briefing. All he needed now was to have the right individuals in the meeting. Marzell had neatly pressed and starched his uniform, making sure that the many medals and ribbons he'd earned were visible on his chest. He wanted to make sure that everyone was reminded of many achievements. A blinking on his datapad let him know that they were ready for him. He took a deep breath and swiped up, catching the latter half of his introduction. "Chan Marzell, hear us loud and clear?" the figure at the head of the table asked. "Of course, good sir. Tell me how to help," Marzell responded with a dip of his head. Marzell sat still and gazed at the cabinet assembled before him. He cursed silently. It was mostly federal cabinet members and not corporate leaders as he'd hoped. He could see 12 political bigwigs, each one wearing the standard white suit and robes signifying their status. Captain Marzell, the Orang at the head of the table, spoke first. "You have ignored our summons for days now. I expect a valid reason." "Indeed. A captain of your status cannot simply elope, even for a distress call. We have QRTs for a reason," came an assertive statement from the synthesizer of the advisor to the left of the Orang. Marzell paused to ensure that nobody else wished to speak. Blue glow of the screen illuminating his gray face. When none of the others he could see spoke, he inhaled and said, "My ship happened upon a grisly sight. Upon answering an unintelligible distress signal in the Sol system, we engaged our faster-than-light drives to rescue what we could. There was nothing. The unknown attackers destroyed every single escape pod." Marzell paused for effect, watching the reactions on their faces. "They purged large swaths of the ship's computers. Not that it would have done us any good. Everything was written in a language we didn't understand. The engines were ruined, serial numbers scratched off, computers scuttled." Marzell purposefully gave such specific details for a reason. It removed the necessity for a question regarding the whys. They knew what he was doing, and now they knew why. Marzell continued, not waiting for anyone to question or interrupt him. Not a single remnant of the crew could be found, aside from an arm floating in space. No bodies, nothing, aside from one individual, a human named Beregev. We do not know how they missed him, nor do we even know if he was a passenger or an attacker. We at first had no idea what he was until our outdated AI system Ed 121 piped up. Ed informed us of Beregev's name, race, and language, so we stayed to examine the ship. Marzell finished strongly. Several individuals that had been looking bored before now surveyed the captain with interest. "What?" The same Orang sputtered out an indignant response. "So he isn't a new species as you originally said? Why does your AI know what it is and nobody else?" came that same individual beside the Orang. "The Sol system. What? How in the world was there a ship there? Nobody's been there for over a year, aside from pirates, that is." A third politician said, "A CHCAT." Marzell again waited to see if anyone else wanted to talk. When nobody spoke up, he inhaled and said, "We don't know. Beregev has provided limited insight." Ed, alongside him. "Ed says that humans come from the Sol system. We're still trying to figure that out." Marzell said with a slight hiss. These were the same questions Grimp and the crew had asked earlier. If it is not a new species, then just dump it somewhere. Why waste our time? Came again the Orang, who Marzell noted was named Grump. A brief increase in the volume in the room as the table erupted into discourse. The suggestion to just kill the human was not popular. Marzell groaned. He felt like the council members were acting like children. They had the same questions as his crew. "No, come on. If it's a lost species, we need to study it, not destroy it," someone said after it had calmed down. "I agree. That is the job of the Federation, to uplift and protect." Think about it. Based on Marzell's explanation, the attackers were highly skilled. Why would they leave a single individual if it wasn't one of their own? Just kill it and avoid this mess, Orang spoke, shushing his companions. Marzell was hoping to avoid that. He knew his crew would vote to disobey that order, and someone noticed it. Marzell groaned as a new voice, that of a Turg. "At least let our scientific cabinet examine it. If it's an old species, our records will have something on it. If it's hostile or a pirate, we can just kill it." It was a good compromise, at least in Marzell's eyes. It left a chance for Beregev to survive. The Orang didn't like it. That much was obvious. His mandibles clicked in irritation. Marzell reflected that there had to be a reason for his immediate decision to kill the human. He didn't even deliberate with anyone. "Your point is made, Sir Grurbed. Marzell will bring the human here. We will study it, and then if it is in any way deemed necessary, we will kill it." That last sentence seemed to be a threat to Marzell. "So as you say, shall it be done?" Marzell bowed slightly, and the connection was severed. A faded image of the menacing yellow mandibles of the Orang that had it out for Beregev. Marzell sighed in relief. The crew wouldn't have to vote to disobey an order. That would certainly make some happy. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his now cramped muscles. He winces as the stringy muscle in his shoulder spasms. Marzell stood and found a spring to be in his step as he walked toward the bridge. He stopped abruptly in his tracks when he ducked through the whizzing door of the porthole that opened into the common area. Beregev sat atop a table in a wheelchair. Dozens of crew members clustered around him. He seemed to be telling a story. The scared primate that Marzell had seen before was gone. Marzell smiled and turned toward the bridge. Matt and Pat were back at their usual post by the door. They saluted as Marzell approached. Marzell returned the gesture and smirked, stepping through the door. When Marzell entered the bridge, he found that it was abuzz again. This time not with excitement or cheer, but with anxiety. They had arrived in Federation space. Marzell barely had time to sit in his chair before someone was radioing them. "This is radio operator 22314 calling the diverse." Some robotic-sounding voice burbled over the intercom. "This is the diverse. You have Captain Marzell here." Marzell replied. "Ah, Marzell, here with that special cargo?" the voice quipped. "Yes, sir," Marzell said as the ship that had been radioing them appeared from behind an asteroid. "Make haste then, they're awaiting you, up at the Snarl. Before you go through, I need your authorization number. You know, protocol and all." The radio operator drawled. Everybody knew Marzell. "Come on, you have it memorized already, whatever. Charlie Tango 1124, Marzell said, poking fun at the operator. Yeah, Marzell, just get your ass to the Snarl." Marzell clicked off the transmitter and leaned back. He figured he should address the crew. They were expecting a vote, and now they didn't need one. The Federation's leaders hadn't ordered Marzell to do anything to the human. The familiar sound of microphone feedback whined on the bridge. "Attention, this is Marzell speaking. I met with the feds earlier this morning. We are to deliver Beregev to the Snarl for them to examine him." He pauses for a moment. "We don't have to vote. Beregev is in no danger." Marzell heard distant cheers as he clicked off the pause system. He was proud of the crew. Their unbridled excitement was infectious. He nodded toward the ship in his viewport as it about faced and puttered away. The next stop was the Snarl, a winding metal abomination that was the neutral meeting ground for the Federation Council meetings. For now, though, the ship had some quality of life improvements that needed to be made. Long hours of warp caused metallic build-up on the exhaust system. It was unsightly as well as being a hazard, unbecoming of a ship of such high standing. It was part of Marzell's duties to make sure that the scrubbing went smoothly. He stood from his captain chair yet again and waltzed down toward the cramped office where Mort resided. "Ah, Marzell," I heard the announcement. "We're headed for the Snarl, aren't we?" Mort asked, not scaring Marzell this time. "Yes, of course. You know why I'm here then?" Marzell leaned forward toward the shorter individual. Yeah, gotta scrub the exhausts. Do you remember the human vac-suit camera? The one I asked for?" Mort inquired. "Yes, the one that I told you to just ask 10 for," Marzell replied. Yes. Ed helped me access the memory banks for the primitive camera. What I discovered was quite shocking, if you would." Mort waved his arm and bowed, leading Marzell to a screen built into the wall. The engineer's hub was empty aside from Marzell and Mort. The rest of the higher-up techies were likely gearing up to go into the limited atmosphere of the engine room. The panels of blinking lights warbled and flickered in a dizzying way, almost as though they were determined to make Marzell have a seizure. The veteran wasn't worried, though. He straightened up and surveyed the camera. Beregev must have had some technical job on Freedom. He was outside when it happened. That might have been why he lived, I don't know. Mort explained as he navigated to the saved footage from Beregev's camera. The camera's footage begins. It puzzled Marzell as to why such a young individual would be given such a dangerous job. Then again, the Trivolks were shorter-lived, and they worked on ships in 0GS. There was no audio as Beregev's trained hands worked at some wires in an exposed panel towards the back of the ship. Some noise must have alerted him, and he looked up. The sight he witnessed shook Marzell to the core. A hunting colossal-sized ship loomed in the distance, and swarms of smaller ships churned toward Freedom. They peppered the hull of the ship, using some form of electromagnet connection to attach themselves to the hull of Freedom. Marzell had never seen anything like it. No insignia or letters were visible on the big ship, which worried Marzell. He didn't like the implications of secrecy. Beregev's movements became garbled as Mort fast-forwarded the tape. Beregev had been running through one of the hallways that Marzell recognized when the wall beside him corroded open and caved inward. The person in front of Beregev fell as the attacker unloaded his weapon into his back. Mort froze the frame right as the attacker stepped out of the foreign pod. It was another human weapon raised, blood smeared across its yellowed visor. It was another human weapon raised, and blood smeared across its yellowed visor. Marzell let his mouth hang agape in shock as he surveyed the image before him. His entire set of hypotheses crashed down around him. The blue pixels arranged in front of him seemed to laugh at his confusion. What? Marzell exclaimed as his brain processed the image on the screen, and he waved his arms. "I have no idea. This I don't understand. At all. Why are humans attacking each other? Why did they remove the bodies? Why have we never heard of them?" Mort barfed out hurriedly, overloading Marzell with information, and started to hyperventilate. Slow down, Marzell said with a wave of his hand. "Send me the file. I'll talk to Ed again and see what he can glean from it. Do not, for any reason, show this to the crew or council. Not at least until we know more," Marzell stated plainly and slowly. "Yes, sir," Mort calmed down. Marzell was good at simplifying issues into expanded instructions and smaller tasks. Marzell stared at the screen as Mort typed away. The featureless red-stained mask of the human attacker forever burned into his brain. Marzell knew at once why the ship had felt wrong. The soul of the automatron was angry at the creators of its metallic flesh for turning on one another. Marzell felt a prickle of fear slide down his spine like a jolt of electricity. He nodded to Mort and backed out of the labyrinth of computers and servos. He brooded on the strange armored individual. More and more he felt that the diverse was entangling itself into a vast and dangerous conspiracy. He thought that Beregev was right at the center of it all, chaotic events swirling around his skinny form. He sat slumped in his command chair, brooding. Time seemed for him slowed as he rolled over and over in his head the footage he had seen. He was blind and deaf to the workings of the ship as the video replayed in his mind. Each detail was as sharp and as clear as it had been when he first saw it. He saw the green glow of the bacteria as it ate its way through the hull, the red smears against the walls opposite the deckhand that ran ahead of Beregev. It seemed robotic and procedural, the chaos of the attack. Marzell settled on the idea that it was not pirates. Pirates, while they did use kinetics, didn't launch such a coordinated attack. They didn't use such blatantly violent tactics. A revealed pirate is a dead one, was the saying. These human attackers opened with violence and blinding speed. Marzell had an epiphany. Grimp was ex-military, and perhaps he could provide a more educated insight than he or even Ed could. Despite his experience and Ed's vast libraries of knowledge, he thought maybe Grimp's practical experience would introduce a unique perspective. Grimp was a veteran of 2 tours of duty stretching across 4 of the Turg years. He'd seen it all, he'd proclaim over drinks after hours. Marzell waved Grimp over, who approached on 4 legs. "Sir," he asked inquisitively when he stopped walking and saluted. "I need your opinion on some things. Report to my quarters later after the curfew. I need a private conversation with Ed in the meantime. Let me know if we get any more strange signals before then." Marzell replied, chuckling. "So as you say shall it be done," Grimp said with a smirk. His paranoia may have been valid after all, Marzell thought. Marzell walked out of the bridge when his datapad notified him that Mort had sent the file over. He walked quickly through the common area again, head facing down, as the crowded room barely noticed him. His translator caught the tail end of a story Beregev was telling. It sounded like an impressive story, like one a mother would tell her children before bed. The crew was captivated. Marzell didn't linger long in the room. He slipped out of view when the occupied crew didn't notice him. Seated comfortably in his custom oversized office chair, he opened the footage that Mort had sent to him. He watched again the disturbing video without any fast-forwarding from Mort. He knew it would only make him sick to his stomach, but he hunched over the rectangular datapad. He watched as Beregev stood paralyzed on the hull of the ship as the nameless human vessel blinked into existence. He watched as Berejev's brain kicked into gear, and he fled. The rain of single-man drop pods peppered the hull behind him. Berejev's first instinct was to flee, Marzell noted. It confused Marzell then when Beregev first met the human attackers. He launched himself recklessly at the armed human. The shaky camera followed as Beregev gave his head a little shake and sprinted as fast as his legs would carry him toward the hijacker. Marzell guessed that it was the unexpectedness of the attack that carried Beregev through the fight. Beregev wrestled the boarder's weapon from him and kicked it away. Marzell found himself gripping the sides of his desk as the more experienced assailant drew a knife and plunged it into the meaty part of Berejev's leg near the joint towards its midsection. He suppressed a cry of despair as Beregev collapsed under the larger individual's weight. Then, just as chaotically as the fight had begun, someone appeared and sent forth 2 blasts from their own weapon into Berejev's attacker's head. Marzell sighed in relief as Berejev's savior helped Beregev to his feet and embraced him. The footage ended with the face of Berejev's savior reaching up to turn off the camera. "Ed!" Marzell shouted suddenly. "Sir," Ed purred, ready as always. "Can you see his face well enough?" Marzell stood pointing to the puckered face behind the clear visor of the human that rescued Beregev. Something in the identical red hair on the older-looking human made Marzell feel nostalgic. As he stared at the grainy image, he noticed a familiar-looking nose. Little yellow lines buffeted the still image as Ed inferred what Marzell wanted. It would appear, based on the facial structure of the individual, that this is another human. Ed quipped forlornly. I know that, you twat. He just looks uncannily similar to Beregev, Marzell said as he gestured toward the screen. That is true. Without a genetic sample, it's impossible to say for sure. But if I had money, I'd put it on whoever that is being one of Beregev's siblings. Ed replied from somewhere in the ceiling above Marzell. Might explain why Beregev clams up. Humans must not take well to losing blood relatives. Marzell said questioningly. Turgs didn't put such heavy importance on family. All that mattered to him was the family he found along the way. It's possible. Beregev certainly didn't want to get force-wiped. Ed continued, not really understanding death. Nobody had died aboard the Diverse. Marzell didn't hear anything more from Ed. He was alone in his room as he pondered the footage and the questions it brought. Why did the humans attack themselves? Marzell knew of rebels and political dissidents, but they never made it off-world. Was Beregev a rebel? Freedom being a rebel ship made sense, with the filed-off serial numbers and unique name. What he didn't understand was the attacking ship. If they were rebels, the logical solution would have been for the human government to just shoot Freedom out of the sky and say to hell with the people aboard. Then he remembered the missing data and the primitive kinetic weapons. Maybe the ship had stolen some critical documentation that for some reason the humans didn't have a copy of. Or the much more likely scenario was that human weaponry wasn't advanced enough to just blast Freedom out of space. Marzell would have to ask the more tactically gifted Grimp for his opinion. Grimp didn't make him wait all that long. Right before Marzell was going to call it and head to bed to clear his mind, Grimp tapped lightly on Marzell's door. Marzell tapped on a button and the door opened. Grimp had to stoop to fit into Marzell's room. Grimp was larger than Marzell by a long shot. "What have you got, Captain?" Grimp asked, bending down and peering at the datapad at Marzell's desk. Mort found a camera on Beregev's vac suit. He was able to get some footage from Freedom. "I wanted some of your perspectives." "Your army, right?" Marzell asked, knowing Grimp had military experience. "Oh, roll the tape. I'll see what I see," Grimp said, letting all emotion drain from his face. Marzell played again the now familiar tape and studied Grimp's reaction. For a moment, when the giant ship appears, there is a flicker of recognition. Marzell inhaled to speak, but Grimp preempted him. "That ship looks almost exactly like the carrier ships we used to launch fighters. Do you know who the attackers are?" Grimp asked, gazing at the footage. "Yeah, the attackers were Human Watch," Marzell said softly. "Well, I'll be damned," Grimp exhaled sharply when he got his first look at the human attackers. "I guess that means piracy is out of the equation?" Grimp inquired with a tilt of his head. "Yeah, definitely not pirates." "What do you mean the ship looked the same?" Marzell asked, stopping the recording. Grimp described from memory the Federation's standardized dropship. Each alien race had its own military that adhered to the cultural customs and building practices of its homeworld. However, the Federation as a governing body had a military of its own, designs and practices voted on by the governing body. This meant that every Galactic Federation soldier got issued the same weapon, armor, food, and uniform. It enforced discipline and the utility of the average soldier. Everyone knew how to use everyone else's weapons and equipment. Everyone was a specialist. The only differences I can see is a more angular design. No anti-corrosion coating on the hull, and the bridge is in the wrong place. I don't know what to think. Grimp pointed out the differences on the screen as he said them. "Do you think they stole the design from us? Maybe they're mooching off our designs." Marzell wondered aloud. "I don't think so. Why would they steal our ship design and then make it worse? Furthermore, how did they steal it undetected?" Grimp challenged. "Good point. Maybe humans were around before we were, or maybe they were some ancient race." The idea had sprung into Marzell's head right as he said it. It would certainly explain the odd familiarity in the human ships. It would explain the existence of the Red Cross and tourniquets. It was a long shot, and Marzell spoke skeptically. "Nah, it's more likely that the humans have just slipped through the cracks, stealing ideas and information. They might have stolen the plans for an earlier version of the carrier ships. Or their tech just isn't as advanced as ours. Grimp was logical. Marzell was always appreciative. Yeah, that's probably more likely, especially with Ed saying they come from Terra, Marzell said, putting away the datapad. Grimp and Marzell had reached an impasse. Ed could provide no further insight. He simply didn't know. All the information he had on humans was generalized, outdated information. There weren't any human computers that Ed could communicate with to give the diverse, accurate information. With no glaringly obvious conclusions that Marzell could see, he dismissed Grimp and decided to retire. He needed his rest if he wanted to put on a good show for the Snarl tomorrow. He'd need to inform Beregev of their plans. He'd get 10 to find an external translator for Beregev to use to talk to the politicians and scientists he'd be meeting tomorrow. As Marzell slipped soundly into sleep, he pondered the ethics of the impending situation. He didn't like that Beregev would be poked and prodded. Marzell knew humans were a sentient species. The only people Beregev needed to convince were the diplomats and dignitaries of the Galactic Federation. The next morning, Marzell made his way down to the medbay to brief Beregev. Normally, he let people fend for themselves, but Beregev was a member of the crew and a part of the ship. It was dismaying when he arrived in the medbay and discovered that Beregev was not there. Tend couldn't provide any explanation. He just hadn't returned with Turk when she took him out to meet the crew. Sometimes misfortunes turned to blessings as Tend gave Marzell a translator for Beregev. Marzell walked through the hallways toward the commons area where he had last seen Beregev. The area was bare, with nobody in the area aside from some late risers. Marzell almost went to ask one of the patrons that sat hunched over their breakfasts, when he remembered that he could just radio Turk, who had been told to remain at Berejev's side. "Turk, where are you and Beregev right now?" Marzell asked, leaning into his transmitter. "You've got Turk here. How can I help my captain?" Turk replied brightly. "Where are you and Beregev?" "We're docking at the Snarl in a couple of hours, and I need to brief Beregev and get him a translator." Of course. We're in one of the recreation rooms. You know that one with the big window?" Turk asked slowly, making sure her message was broadcasted clearly. "Yeah, that one with the weird trivolt couches? I'll be there in a few. Marzell out." Marzell hurried. As a child in the droughts, his line boss on the condensation farms would always whip him for walking too slowly. It was always "pick up more Marzell, carry it faster Marzell." Even now, decades later, he hurried when he was anxious. He entered the wide and cool room, scanning for Beregev and Turk. He spotted them standing in the middle of a massive window that gave a perfect view of the Snarl as the Diverse circled it in a wide arc, working closer so they could dock safely. "Ah, Turk, Beregev. There you are." Marzell opened his arms and walked up, speaking slowly so his translator could keep up. "Captain Marzell." Turk saluted and Beregev turned his chair around, sloppily saluting with the wrong hand. Marzell decided he'd let it slide considering Berejev's condition. "Hey there, Beregev." Marzell returned the salute and crouched, getting almost level with the young human. "You know you're very important. You're so important that the people in charge want to know more about you. We don't know much about you. You've got to answer their questions." Marzell spoke slowly, as if he were explaining basic concepts to a young child. Beregev drank in his words, as if he understood the gravity of the situation and was determined to succeed. "They won't be able to speak your language. I've got you a translator. You just press the little black button and talk into it. They'll understand." Marzell demonstrated how to use the handheld translator and handed it to Beregev. "You try, okay? Show me you can use it." Marzell backed up a step. Turk had stopped standing at attention and beckoned Beregev, who put the device to his lips. "Hello?" Beregev cringed as a squeal of feedback pierced the quiet room. Very good, you're a natural." Marzell patted a hand on Berejev's shoulder. "You'll win some hearts and minds if you use standard courtesies. No doubt you'll surprise a few scientists. Would you like me to teach you?" Marzell asked, speaking in a different language and becoming Beregev to read the translation on the screen of the device in his hands. Beregev peered at the screen. and then nodded. Yes, teach me. Please. Marzell nodded and began to teach Beregev basic courtesies and manners, how to greet council members, and gestures of fealty he could make with his hand. He taught Beregev what white robes meant and what to do when someone wearing one walked in. Finally, he taught Beregev about his predatory species. He told Beregev not to make sudden movements, not to speak loudly, and most importantly not to bare his teeth. Wait, what? He stammered with a confused look squarely on his face. What do you mean, prey species? You mean there are aliens who aren't at the top of the food chain? His tone suggested that the revelation baffled him completely. Yes, humans by all accounts are a predatory species. There was an incident where a set of diplomats got eaten by a species we were trying to uplift because they acted like prey and triggered the food response of the natives. Marzell explained to the dumbfounded Beregev. I'm sorry, Turk. I realize now why all those other cheat cats were so scared. Beregev looked mortified, as if the thought of eating an alien made him sick to his stomach. Turk giggled at Berejev's mispronunciation of her race. Marzell found it amusing that the human could so improperly pronounce ch-cat so fluidly. He paused in his demonstration to say, I can assure you, Beregev, you've offended nobody. We're all so glad you've opened up. Really? That's a relief. I didn't think I was that remarkable. I'm just a kid, Beregev replied, looking ecstatic that he had not offended anyone. Oh, never talk down about yourself like that. You're, from what I've seen, quite the legend. Marzell consoled the human gently. Marzell had to make his excuses when Grimp called him back to the bridge. Marzell was needed to oversee docking. Besides, it was a good image for the captain to initiate docking. He walked back into the bridge's warm confines and stood beside his chair, stooping over the screen arm, right as the operator inside the snarl started communicating with them. Calling the diverse, ready to initiate docking, the operator quipped. Yes, sir, we're scrubbed and ready. Got that special cargo ready and waiting. Marzell brightly said to the radio operator. Ah, good. Have him ready at the airlock. We're happy to finally be meeting this legendary individual. The operator sputtered slightly with static. Marzell walked back to the room where he had last seen Beregev, and he found him sitting there still. His wheelchair faced away from the window, and at the snarl, Beregev and Turk were deep in conversation. Beregev raised his hand to point at something, and Turk leaned in to explain what it was. Ah, Beregev ready for the big moment? Marzell asked, barely able to contain his excitement. He wanted to share Beregev with the universe. Of course, sir, Beregev responded brightly. Marzell took Beregev to the quartermaster and spent an hour getting a proper uniform top and bottom tailored for him. They took the top Turk had given him and fitted it to his unique form. They sewed up the left sleeve and got him a little cap to wear over his hair. Turk helped him stand before the mirror in the corner of the room. You've got some proper dress blues now. How about that? I like it. Really, Beregev replied. Marzell dressed in his nicest, most neatly pressed uniform and stood beside Beregev as he walked toward the airlock. He looked reassuringly at the human who clutched Turk's hand in his, then back toward the slowly opening doors. Instead of scientists and dignitaries, Marzell and Beregev were greeted with a squad of armored weapon-wielding soldiers. Instead of scientists and dignitaries, Marzell and Beregev were greeted with a squad of armored weapon-wielding soldiers. Turk at first was worried. Gun-toting mercs were never a good sign. She gripped the rubber-coated handles of the wheelchair Beregev sat in. She exhaled heavily as Grump, one of the more important political minds, appeared from behind the security officers. He opened his arms up in a decidedly undignified gesture. Ah, Marzell, glad you made it safely. Come, there are many things to discuss. Quite a lot has unfolded since we last spoke. My officers will take care of the human. Grump said, clicking his mandibles and putting an arm around Marzell. Something in his purplish eyes unnerved Turk. He gazed at the human as if it were a meal waiting to be consumed. Marzell stiffly pushed Grump's arm off of his side and bowed slightly. Turk guessed that he did so not as a courtesy, but to hide the look on his face. When he stood up again, he nodded to Turk, who walked forward with the officers, feeling hairs on her back stand up, as she knew Grump stared daggers into her back. "Of course, good sir. Turk shall accompany Beregev to his quarters." Marzell was in no position to argue. Turk dared not risk a look back. The only sound for a long time as Beregev tried fruitlessly to win over the grizzled-looking security officers that encircled him. He tried every gesture Marzell had taught him to no avail. Turk felt her face flush when his shoulders slumped. Something told her to keep quiet. Something in the half-hearted hug Marzell had received oozed tension. Turk had an almost photographic memory. She'd been to the Snarl twice in her life, and never had she seen such guarded expressions on the officers and staff. She thought hard as she tried to remember what could have happened in the short time it had been since Marzell had made his announcement. In silence, she passed tired-looking yellow-clad faculty grumbling and slouching as they went about their duties. Abruptly, the black-clad officer at the head of the procession stopped and rapped loudly on a gray door with a red cross in the center. Turk wondered why he didn't just use his card. There must be some technical problem. This didn't help her worry. The Snarl never had technical problems. "Open the ing door, J.K." the officer shouted when he stopped banging on the door. His black uniform clashed wildly with the stark whites of the polymer walls. Whoever this J.K. was finally got the door to open, and Turk almost jumped. J.K. was another four-armed jarkle like 10 back on the diverse. She looked wrecked. Their usually bluish skin was gray, and her eyes drooped. Turk guessed that she hadn't slept or molted in weeks. As soon as Turk followed the officer inside, it became apparent why she hadn't caught any sleep. Every bed in the hospital room was occupied. All manner of species lay on the beds, clad in bluish hospital smocks and afflicted with gruesome injuries. All of them looked recent. Turk didn't have time to offer aid or sympathy, and the officer behind her nudged her forward with his arm. J.K. opened a set of double doors and gestured for the black-clad head officer to follow. Turk risked a look back to see J.K. rush back toward her patients. Again, the officer behind her nudged her. With every step forward, it felt like a prison they were willingly walking into. The guards fanned out against a back wall of what Turk realized was a lab. The light was annoyingly bright, and she could almost hear the bulbs hum. Beregev squinted as his eyes adjusted to the light. Green-tinted rows of button-burdened machinery and instruments lined the walls, and a solitary observation table was elevated in the middle of the room. "There he is, Beregev," Turk almost yelped as a Volk appeared, dimming slightly the lights, and walked forward, kneeling before Beregev. Turk noticed that none of the tension exhibited by the installation at large had seeped into the features of the Volk. Beregev twisted his hand into the gesture he had tried on the officers and nodded. "Hello, you already know my name?" Beregev spoke to the amazement of the Volk science officer. "And he's done his homework." "Yes, I already know your name. You appear to know some customs. Curious, very curious. What say we get you some arms and legs?" the scientist asked, standing and regarding Turk. "You can do that? Really? I'll be able to walk again?" Beregev asked excitedly. "Oh, of course, who might you be?" the Volk asked, patting Berejev's head like a mutt. "Oh, sir, I'm Turk. I've been assigned to watch over Beregev," Turk replied, bowing slightly to acknowledge the differences in their standings. "I see. Apologies for the ensemble. Trying times are on the horizon with this discovery. Or rediscovery, I think it is proper to call it. I've got it from here." Volk waved away the officers, who left without another word. Volk's white robes indicated that he held political influence. The easy way of speaking exhibited by the cream-colored Volk helped Turk to dismiss the feelings of unease she cultivated on the short walk to the private lab that Marzell had told her about. A hand wave by the Volk, and a few more scientists and technicians walked into the room, lining up where the guards had been. "It's quite all right. Might I ask what the reason is for all the added security and equipment difficulties?" Turk decided not to include the details of her low standing within the diverse. She had a position of influence with her closeness to Beregev. "An observant one you are, yes. An explosion in the reactor area at the center of the Snarl. We've been dealing with power shortages all day. The extra security is a QRT activated to help get things in order with the diverse. Several officers were injured. Volk spoke dismissively as he walked back toward Beregev. Enough doom and gloom about those new legs. We're gonna get you onto the table for some measurements if you don't mind, Volk asked, both as a question for Beregev and dismissal of Turk's questions. Turk bowed again and moved to help the Volk to lift Beregev, who nodded, onto the table in the center of the room. Volk glanced once behind Turk toward the lined-up scientist on the wall. Beregev laid back, missing limbs highlighted by the bright light. Just lay still. Let the scan do its job, Turk. If you don't mind answering some questions. Unfortunately, our current information on humans is lacking. Volk was assertive, which helped Turk finally abandon her worries. Or at least, push them into the recesses of her mind. Of course, sir. Ask away. Turk stood somewhat awkwardly as the scientist behind her kept appearing and swarming Beregev. Clipboards were aplenty, and the dull scratching of style rang in the soundproof room. The Volk ushered Turk away from Beregev and toward a desk in a corner of the room. Berejev's eyes never left his furred companion as the scientists collected their data. Turk sat opposite the political scientist who seemed to be in charge and folded her hands in her lap. Her ears bent and flexed as she collected data with her other senses aside from vision. Volk asked about everything. He asked about Berejev's looks, his age, and his gender. He inquired about what Beregev ate and how he lost his limbs, and he asked about Berejev's family. Turk regretted that she didn't have much to offer the Volk. Yet every word Turk spoke seemed to make him more ecstatic. His animated responses never ceased in their return. Turk was unaware of the time that passed. She only was made aware of the lateness of the day when Volk broke up the monotony of his questions to say, "It seems that they're finished with the measurements. You can go and rest. You'll have to report manually to Marzell. Our comms have been haywire ever since the explosion. Come back as soon as you can. From what you've said, Beregev is a little clingy. He'll have to stay here, of course. He's endurance-based, and he'll be fine." "Oh, of course." Turk stood and walked toward the door, then stopped to send a reassuring glance at Beregev. It was only after Turk had walked out of the lab that she realized she didn't know where Marzell was. As an afterthought, she pressed the transmit button on her communicator and tried to radio Marzell. She received nothing but static in return. Turk walked back through the hallways back toward the diverse to wait for Marzell to return from that meeting Grump had mentioned. Matt and Pat stood beside the airlock doors that led to the hallways where the diverse had docked. They nodded politely as she walked past. They'd always been nice to her, she'd never known why. Turk realized that Marzell wouldn't leave Beregev. The diverse would probably be stuck at the Snarl for a while. She'd ask Matt and Pat about it when she got the chance. It was in the wee hours of the morning that Marzell got back. His uniform was crumpled, and he looked like he had a headache. Turk had been standing at attention for 5 minutes on the bridge when he noticed her. "I take it their comms weren't working, and they sent you here to manually report to me?" Marzell asked Turk when he waved her over. "Yes, sir. I tried to contact you earlier, but received nothing." Marzell laughed explosively before Turk could finish. "PFFT, haha, likely story. Grump is covering something up. He was damn near pissing out his face with worry. Try to stay with Beregev from now on. I get the feeling Grump'll try to pull a fast one on us. Every question he asked he tried to turn around on me. I'll bet he's ass-kissing his way to everyone else believing the same as him. The lack of data on humans is problematic. He may find some data on humans that says that the Federation was the ones that killed them off." It was clear to Turk that Marzell had had an irritating day. "Tell me about the security guys. I noticed they were QRTs." Marzell slouched back, keeping his eyes on Turk. "Oh, the Volk who was in charge of examining Beregev said that an explosion in the reactor room called for extra security, and that the explosion has been messing with the power," Turk replied quickly and quietly. "Yeah, sure, negligence caused the explosion. You don't activate QRTS for negligence. Whatever. It doesn't concern us. Likely some pissed-off worker mad at pay cuts and hostile policy had an accident on duty. That all made sense to Turk. She didn't have a head for these little details. Marzell was far her superior, and there was a reason that he was so good at his job. They said they'd give Beregev prosthetics, Turk said when the conversation died down. Did they now? Great. Grump surely won't leverage that later. Marzell ran a hand over his face. Be careful, Turk. Neither Turk nor Marzell got any sleep that night. Not for lack of trying on their parts, though. There just weren't enough hours in a cycle. Marzell went again back into the snarl for more evaluative meetings. He'd mocked squishing Grump's head behind his back. Turk was escorted again by the squad of 6 soldiers and their black-clad leader. Now that she wasn't focused on Beregev, she had a chance to examine the soldiers. It was obvious that the one in black was the leader. She still couldn't figure out what race they were. It bothered her. Each one wore a gray-tinted visor and full SEAL combat vac suit. She tried to make polite small talk. So, heard there's a human here on the snarl. Turk received no responses. The guards or soldiers, she didn't know. They all looked the same to her and weren't chatty. That was fine with her, as long as they were not out to get her. This time the guards stayed in the room. The Volk had made up a bed for Beregev to sleep on in Turk's absence. When Turk entered the room, Berejev's face brightened. She walked over, and they shared a whispered conversation, while they waited for the Volk to arrive again. I'm sorry I left. I needed to talk to Marzell. Are you all right? Turk asked quietly, bouncing from foot to foot. It's okay, really. They just asked me all sorts of questions. Moral questions, as if they were wanting me to attack or something. Beregev replied, clenching his hand around hers. Did you attack or anything? Why'd they ask you questions like that? Turk asked, suddenly looking serious. I don't know. I'm not going to attack the people who said they were going to give me legs again. I hate being crippled. Beregev spoke with such conviction that she half expected him to just grow a new arm and leg. Have you had anything to eat? You need lots of food, right? Turk asked like a worried grandmother. No, they said they'd give me food soon. I'm used to going hungry. It's okay. Beregev replied as the Volk walked back into the room. The guards stayed in the room as the scientists filed in. The 2 in the back were carrying a large orange case. The 2 scientists that were carrying it sat it atop the desk that Turk had sat at yesterday to answer questions about Beregev. The Volk walked over to the examination table Beregev sat on and motioned for him to lie down. Unfortunately for us, replicated limbs are illegal, but not to fret. We've got some handy cybernetics for you. The Volk explained with wide, sweeping hand motions as if to put the very relaxed Beregev more at ease. We'll need to operate to make them work. Get the sockets installed. You'll wake up in a few hours. Turk realized that the wide hand motions were to distract Beregev. Turk knew she was scared of needles. She couldn't imagine a creature that wasn't. Beregev tried to fight the sedatives, but gave up when Turk remembered her purpose and nodded. Tut tut, I wish we didn't have to knock them out, the Volk said with a tone of regret. Turk stepped back as the orangish red mechanical limbs were removed from the hard case they'd been transported in. They mirrored Berejev's remaining limbs exactly. Turk's details-obsessed brain was finally put at ease. Though she didn't like watching and tried to leave, the guards subtly blocked the door. They first started by removing the bone of his residual arm, replacing it with some metallic substitute. Turk knew she shouldn't watch, but she couldn't take her eyes away. Berejev's almost healed stump was cut into and shoved into a metal device that his prosthetic would click into. She had to admit, it looked interesting once the technical aspect kicked in and Beregev was sewed back up. Time flew by faster than the speed of light. Turk was not bored while Beregev was under. She had plenty of thought-provoking things to look at. Green lights blinked across the screens of the datapads the various scientific officers standing around Beregev carried. One of them nodded to the Volk, and then they distanced themselves to stand at various instruments along the walls. I'll be teaching him how to put them on. Our guess is that he won't want to sleep with them on, at least not in the beginning. Before he wakes up, would you like a rundown? So you can help him? Volk said in what would be classified as a question, but felt more like an order. Yes, sir, Turk replied enthusiastically, returning to Beregev's bedside. The scientific peoples aboard the Snarl had removed Beregev's uniform and dressed him in a foreign-looking smock made of a paper-like material, presumably to preserve his uniform. Turk noted that the red color of the prosthetics mimicked Beregev's hair color. The Volk expertly demonstrated the one-handed design of the clasp that attached the mechanical limbs to the sockets they'd attached to Beregev. It was simple in Turk's eyes: pull back and push. When the limb clanked against the metal bone, there was a hiss and a beep. To get it off, just press the red button and pull. The Volk said as he demonstrated, "It's the same for the leg." Seems simple enough. I do have to ask though, why remove his bone? Why not just strap it on like regular prosthetics? Turk asked as she removed the limbs to demonstrate her proficiency. Ah, an inquiring mind. We took out the bone because it's easier to do a mechanical clasp with a grounded rod. Prosthetic technology has come a long way in the last few cycles. He'll have his sense of touch back with this method. Granted, the arms are a little heavier because of it. What can you do? He appears to be lacking in muscular growth. The Volk explained. But won't that cause problems? Won't his muscles interfere? Turk asked. Quite the contrary. The metal is coated in an enzyme that forces his muscles to bond to the metal. The residual tissue helps him get more control. As Turk and the Volk talked, Beregev stirred and then groaned. Turk glanced around the room and saw that all the other personnel inside the room, aside from the guards, Beregev, and the Volk, had left. Turk was not put off by this. They'd likely be watching from a camera or false window. Before Turk could address Beregev, Volk spoke up and drowned out her words. Ah, Beregev, you champ. Ready to walk again? Why, yes. Beregev paused to retch over the side of the table. Sorry, he mumbled when nothing came up. Ah, it's no problem. Your system must not like sedatives. We thought maybe that'd happen. Come, sit up. We'll get those legs of yours put on. Volk spoke with a faux brightness Turk knew came from his race's lack of family units. Beregev did as he was ordered, and it was only then that he realized the differences in his stumps. He felt the cool metals and noticed the prosthetics that had been moved to a side table. It itches, Beregev said as he glanced toward Turk, who again inhaled as if to say something and got cut off by Volk. You'll get used to it. Here, Turk, help me please. Volk said, gesturing with his off hand toward the side table. Turk didn't like how Volk was conducting himself. It felt like he was pushing her away, driving a wedge between her and Beregev. It didn't matter though. In a day or two Beregev would be back on the Diverse, where he belonged. Volk showed Beregev how to put the new limbs on, then backed away again, almost cautiously. Try them out. Just little movements, okay? The Volk advised when he was a few feet away. Beregev first held up his new hand, bending and flexing and contracting his fingers slowly. He looked down at his new leg and kicked it slightly. Before anyone could stop him, he pushed himself off of the bed. He stood there, waving his arms slightly as he got used to the clunky nature of his synthetic appendage. He took a tentative first step and flailed, falling forward toward the ground. The Volk doctor caught him and roughly righted him, saying, "Take it slow, all right. You aren't quite ready to walk." The Volk led Beregev to the desk in the corner of the room again. Turk, do go and inform Marzell. Let him know that the limb transportation was a success. Our comms are still out. Turk obeyed, albeit now begrudgingly. The guards followed her out. Their gray visors would always be unnerving to her. She learned that the leader was named Kank, and the guard that always stood behind her was named Letim. The days slipped by with nothing remarkable happening. Turk grew bored of being pushed away. Volk always had some excuse. Oh, the comms are still out, or something along those lines. At least until finally, she insisted that she stayed when the comms, at last, were fixed. Turk was so ecstatic at Volk stammering out a defeated yes, that she didn't notice Volk growing more and more desperate and unfriendly. Again the guards escorted Turk toward the medbay and custom lab. Turk didn't notice that one of the guards had abandoned their gray-tinted visor for a yellow one. Turk didn't notice that one of the guards had abandoned their gray-tinted visor for a yellow one. Beregev did. Beregev always saw. Despite his youth, he was an expert noticer. He always had a knack for spotting danger, except now he was safe, right? He let loose a shout of panic when he twisted his head around to look at the guard flanking Turk. In a moment, a scene that would have been comedic in different circumstances. Beregev gave a great retch with the whole of his body and flopped stupidly out of the wheelchair, face pale and mouth twisted in a visceral noise of pure, unadulterated terror. The guards did the only logical thing that they could do: freeze. They did not understand why this was happening, let alone any idea at all about what to do to contain or calm the unknown bipedal predator. "What is it doing?" the yellow-visored spark of this particular fire inquired. "You think I know?" his companion exclaimed as he moved the wheelchair away. Turk at least had sense enough to realize that Beregev was not doing this with any ill intentions. She never would know what came over her in that moment, but instead of freezing or fleeing, she approached the distraught and flailing Beregev, crouching in front of him as he haphazardly kicked himself away from the danger he saw. A blinking green light from a camera watched from the shadows, taking in the scene like a malignant tumor, waiting to strike. "Hey there," she refrained from offering a hand to Beregev, lest he panic further. "It's okay, whatever you're seeing, it isn't real." Hearing someone speak jarred Beregev like a hand reaching out of the light to pull him from the dark. Beregev breathed hard as though he had just run a marathon in a moment. Turk's eyes softened. She'd been told humans were predators. Not many things made predators afraid. Both of the guards stood dumbfounded. Cats were usually timid, certainly not the type to approach a clear threat. They watched in awe at the bond they shared as Beregev calmed down. Turk motioned for the chair as she helped Beregev up. Despite the weight he'd lost as well as the limbs, Beregev was still a little too much for the young cat. She could barely get him to sit down. Turk had the guards lead her back to the ship, making sure to motion for them to stay quiet and out of Berejev's view, lest he panic again. On the walk, that felt like forever, not a single sound was uttered. The monotony of the journey was broken only by the occasional squeak of a wheel knocked off its bearings in the chair Beregev sat in. She took Beregev to their quarters, promising no tests for the day as he awkwardly dried his face with the sleeve of his uniform. Distantly, she was aware of a feeling of unease, but she pushed it away to focus on Beregev. In the room that had been made for Beregev, to accommodate his unique situation, it was darker than usual. The limited knowledge of humans that the researchers at the Snarl and Ed had been able to glean from Beregev and the strangely empty records on humans was that they preferred cooler temperatures and lower light levels in their private quarters. Turk wheeled Beregev into the room and then sat on his soft bed space in front of him, waiting until the silence became unbearable to speak. "Do you wish to explain yourself?" Sorry, that came out more aggressive than I intended." Turk paused as she tried to find the words to say that would come out of the translator correctly. "What happened back there? Do you want to talk about it?" Turk had never had someone to talk about such serious things with before, nor an opportunity where it felt right to do so. She looked away as a wave of embarrassment flooded her face and Beregev took deep breaths, desperate to calm himself down. It looked like them. Turk paused as Beregev spoke, low and slow. "What looked like them?" Turk breathed, confused. "The guard, the new one." Beregev was pale as his shaky breath produced the ghostly words. "The one with the yellow visor." "Yes." Turk didn't understand how something so trivial could set off such a violent reaction. She guessed it had some connection to a viscerally negative memory for Beregev. Turk thought hard about what to say next. "Why are you scared of them? Are they the reason why we found you as we did?" Beregev nodded. Turk didn't know what to make of this revelation. She'd heard Marzell and Grimp speak in hushed voices about the ship and its state. She'd imagined that some forgotten cosmic god has wreaked its bloody vengeance upon the human ship. The mere idea of an unseen wraith striking with blinding speed and erasing its victims completely terrified Turk. "Who is them?" she continued, fearfully. Beregev's face darkened, but he steadied it, seemingly determined to tell at least someone his peril. Yet even as he opened his mouth to speak, not a sound escaped his lips. Liquid welled up in his eyes, and he looked away. "It's okay. You don't have to say anything now, just, when you're ready. How's your new arm and leg?" Turk tried to divert the conversation. This was the first time that she and Beregev had. She shuddered to wonder at the possible reasons as to why she'd been kept from speaking to him. It didn't matter now, she had time to ask questions. She was forced to wait as Beregev refused to look at her. She realized that he was shivering. The realization prompted her to wonder if he'd be more comfortable on his bed space. She hopped down, moving behind him to pick him up and move him to the bed. She hesitated. "I'm going to put you on the bed so you aren't cold." Beregev still didn't look at her, but he nodded. Turk summoned the last dredges of that strength that had enabled her to lift Beregev before and heaved. He helped as much as his one-legged self could. As soon as Beregev was down on the bed, a buzz in her ear made her aware that communications had just come online. She stood up straight and pressed the communications button. She flinched at the volume and severity of the voice that greeted her. "Whatever bull test Beregev is in, pull him out. We are leaving," came the loud and angry voice of Marzell. It sounded like he was running. "Get on the ship. I don't care what you have to do." "Sir," Turk began to say. "That's an order." "Sir, Beregev and I are already on the ship, and in his quarters there was an incident. Is he safe?" "Safe? I'll explain later. We need to leave for now. Don't leave your room." Turk was immediately anxious. She regretted that she was not authorized to carry a weapon. She didn't understand where these protective and bold instincts came from, but she felt the need to be armed. More than 10 minutes passed as Beregev and Turk sat quietly. She stood and walked to the door when someone knocked. In her haste, she didn't wonder why Marzell wouldn't have knocked, but these worries were cast aside as her desires to carry a weapon were swiftly justified. 3 armed Snarl security officers barged into the room. One aimed their weapon at Beregev, and 2 of the 2 others pounced on Beregev, who remained strangely calm, as if he was used to actions such as this. Turk had been pushed back by the officers and hit her head on the rounded corner of a table against the wall. When she snapped back into reality, she shouted, blearily through the white-hot pain in the side of her head. She groaned as Beregev began to struggle, as he realized that this was really happening. For someone with only 1 arm and leg, he was an expert resistor. Turk put a hand to her head and found it wet when she looked at it. She began to panic as a feeling of powerlessness overwhelmed her. She braced herself against the wall and stepped toward the door, feebly reaching her hand out to brush against the coattails of the officer at the tail end of the group who was abducting Beregev. "Hey, you can't do that, he's a crewman." Her cries and feeble attempts to stop the burly officers went unheeded. In reality, the Federation could reasonably do whatever it wanted. That included illegally detaining an unregistered individual. Someone dressed more formally appeared, pushing her back into the quarters. Another 4 armed individual, kin to Tend. The security officers were down the hallway already. Turk could hear the distant sounds of a scuffle coming from the direction of the airlock that led to the Snarl. Actually, it assaulted an officer. It is being detained as the investigation is being conducted. Turk was stunned. That was obviously false. She had been with Beregev the entire time they'd been at the Snarl, aside from when they were asleep. It worried her that an officer would so freely disclose information such as that. That's impossible. Turk was finding it harder and harder to stand. A dull throb had begun to rise into a painful cacophony of agony where her head had impacted with the desk moments earlier. Irrelevant. In fact, you need to come with me. What? No. Turk backed away from the officer, her trauma-addled brain failing to properly pilot her legs as she fell down to a sitting position. The room had begun to warm to an uncomfortable level. Despite this, Turk's courage, which had burned a painful fire inside mere moments before, had been extinguished, and she froze. "Don't make me get." A massive scaly hand clapped down hard on the comparatively minuscule shoulder of the overstepping detective. Through pained tears, Turk recognized Grimp. Subconsciously, she breathed a sigh of relief. Grimp was protective, to say the very least. Grimp had appeared just in the nick of time. The once confident detective instantly became the sniveling coward he was in the shadows. His face went absolutely still as the hulking reptilian roughly turned him around to face him and stare up at his toothy maw. "Get what exactly?" Not a reply could be heard in the stammered sounds from the detective. Turk took deep breaths as she tried unsuccessfully to clear her vision. She could see that Grimp had a service weapon in his offhand. It puzzled her then when he stuffed it onto a hastily prepared holster on his hip. Grimp manhandled the officer out of the way, and Marzell squeezed himself into the inadequately sized room, gently helping Turk to her feet and out of the room. All was quiet outside the room. Turk could have sworn that Marzell had blood coating his forearms. "Are you all right?" "Why, yeah, good." That was good enough for Marzell at the time, and he turned his attention to the now trapped detective. Turk knew that Marzell was furious by the way he stood up straight. She had only once before seen him so angry. "You, sir, have some explaining to do. You can start by ordering your men to release Beregev." I want." "I don't think I heard you properly," Marzell screamed suddenly, a hiss accenting his words as he clenched his fists. "You have the nerve to illegally board my ship, assault multiple of my crewmen, and then abduct a beloved part of the crew. So I repeat, release Beregev." As Marzell spoke, Grimp tightened his clawed grip on the detective's shoulder. Small beads of blood dripped down from where Grimp's claws pierced his skin. I can't." He attacked an officer. "Code therefore dictates that he be taken in for trial. You can't make me." Marzell chuckled. Turk realized that Marzell wasn't going to flip his lid. He already had flipped his lid. Turk didn't have much experience with a snarl, but what little experience she did have seemed like hell on the planet. Marzell had been in constant meetings and debates trying to get Beregev taken care of and the crew out of there. "Did Beregev attack an officer?" Marzell interrupted the detective. "No, he didn't," Turk replied, sinking to her knees. "She lies. You can't make me do anything." "Make you? I can't make you do anything. What I can do is offer you a choice. Do as I have asked, or we will beat you senseless, take a scan of your DNA, and force our way into the ship and break Beregev out." The harsh threat surprised Turk. There was one case in which amnesty could be granted. If the actions were done in order to save the masses, anything was excusable in the eyes of the Federation. But Beregev was only one person. The harsh words were working against the detective. Turk could see it in his face as she wobbled. "You'll never get away with." "I'll never get away with this?" "I beg to differ, actually." 3 dead communications engineers stuffed into the paneling of the communications deck begs to differ. I've been lied to this whole time by a compromised and corrupted governing body. I can do what I want. Turk couldn't focus anymore. Her head hurt too bad. She couldn't hold on to consciousness. She slumped over and into peaceful unconsciousness. Turk couldn't focus anymore. Her head hurt too bad. She couldn't hold on to consciousness. She slumped over and into peaceful unconsciousness. Marzell had spent a long time out in the field, dealing with pirates, shady merchants, and even conspiring mutineers. This whole ordeal with a snarl had felt much like a back alley dealing with a pirate overlord, with the constant having to go overhead of someone to get anything at all and cutthroat tactics Marzell had experienced and had used to restore communications. Now there were dead government personnel and a kidnapped crew member. He turned to catch Turk as she fell, and the detective took advantage of the new circumstances affecting the situation and fled. He frantically dived for the door. Grimp, who was closest to the door, was physically too large to fit out of the door quickly and let out a sound of exasperation as he was delayed in his pursuit. Marzell watched the coward do what cowards do best and run away. "Take her, I've got a rat to catch." Grimp knew better than to argue with the captain. Besides, Marzell knew what he was doing. He had saved the ship from much worse than some scared public servants. Marzell used his smaller size to worm his way around the now stuck Grimp, and he began to pursue the detective. Marzell knew the route the detective was going to take, so Marzell took an alternate route with the intention of heading him off. He passed a security checkpoint. He shouted and pointed. "You, with me, we're retrieving what's ours. Except you, sound alarm." The two guards that followed, he indicated, nodded, took up their weapons, and followed him. The detective and his guards had taken the main route. The guards told him so. Of course, the detective had claimed to have come in peace, that Marzell himself had authorized him coming to talk to Turk. With the lack of communication until very recently, nobody had thought to inform anyone. In any case, it left more questions than it had answered. Marzell didn't care about the legality of his actions anymore, especially as he considered the murdered engineers. He'd grown fed up with the bureaucracy. He knew that no good deed goes unpunished, but he never figured the consequences would be so severe. He had only hoped to rescue someone from certain death, those long days ago. He'd angrily stormed from a meeting and walked himself to the communication room. He was determined to find from the source why the communications were down and the ship couldn't leave. He knew when he had seen the dead bodies that all of what he had been enduring was a massive conspiracy. He needed to leave. He needed evidence, something. Hindsight is always 20/20th, so they told him at least. His fears had been confirmed as he made it to the primary airlock that connected his ship, the Diversity, to the Snarl. Over his communicator, a security officer blabbered on about how there were 2 dead officers and a stolen keycard. Marzell heard the echo as he made it to the scene just as it was being reported. "Holy hell, you're fast, Captain. He just passed through. You can still get him if you're quick. He got Jacoby." Marzell nodded. In his haste to pursue the detective, he had forgotten about the armed guards. He wondered how one single person had so expertly defeated his security and taken a hostage. He wondered more importantly where the armed guards who'd taken Beregev had gone. "Grimp, do a scan of the ship. Those guards have gone missing." Marzell multitasked and took a micro-sized energy pistol from a dead guard. Grimly, he gave it a shake to remove the wet stain and motioned for his backup to follow him into the breach. The Snarl was in complete disarray. Alarms blared and security doors were beginning to close. Marzell, with his guards in tow, sprinted down the long airlock corridor, trying to make it to a security hub to try to find a way to stop the security doors. They couldn't move fast enough, though, and the doors slammed closed, sealing the 3 of them into a side hallway just meters from their goal. "Marzell, we finished the scan, and the human and the guards were gone. They must have fled into the Snarl. I'm sending a team in. I'll be with them. The gloves are off, Marzell." "Damn it, Grimp, I want to argue with you, but I'm trapped in a hallway, and we don't know where Beregev is. I'm just as illegal now anyways." "Cap, I've got a cutter, one of those breaching knives. We can always use the nuclear option." Marzell closed his communicator and brought himself back to the situation at hand. He had 2 security officers and himself. He took a deep breath. He had rushed into the situation, which was uncharacteristic of him. Yet he felt strangely comforted by the lapse in judgment. After days of inaction, it felt good to simply act without thinking. He hated sitting stagnant in the sterile halls of the Snarl. "I trust you. Besides, we're already using the nuclear option. Get us to a security hub. I can try to override the doors. Grimp is doing something, linking up with us." The officer nodded, and his companion held his weapon ready as he began cutting through the door. "Grimp, make your way toward us. The entire base is on lockdown. Security doors closed." "We have another problem. As soon as we disembarked, Snarl security officers attacked. They were trying to forcefully disembark the Diversity from the airlock. We've returned fire. Think heavily about what you've led us into, Marzell. We're behind you fully." Marzell's face darkened. He knew what that meant. It had to be that damned head councilman, the one who'd advocated for Beregev's disposal. The situation was foggy. None of it made sense. Part of him hoped that the pieces would fall into place. Right quick, fast, and in a hurry. "We're through." Marzell nodded, and the officer pulling security hurried through the breach and quickly trailed behind. The snarl, like with any government body, had been constructed by the lowest bidder that provided the minimum standard. The security doors provided temporary security, as they were mostly reinforced aluminum and steel. Easy, but time-consuming, to cut through with a vibro or energy blade, as they had just done. Thankfully, the security hub for this passageway at minimum was merely on the other side of the door. Marzell signaled for a halt as he spotted energy scarring and those peculiar brass kinetic shells. His heart sank slightly, but he kept his composure. It was just opportunistic pirates, or perhaps political extremists trying to kidnap Beregev to use as a bargaining chip. Marzell was catapulted from his wondering when the lead officer pushed the door open and was instantly cut in half by a blinding flash of energy. Acting on violent experience, Marzell pushed past the falling body and into the security room. Scanning and acquiring a target, he rushed forward as he saw a leveled plasma rifle in his direction. He didn't trust his old bones to move quickly enough to fire first, but he did trust his leg muscles. He batted the CH-Cat officer effortlessly against the wall, snatching a meaty paw out to hold the CH-Cat down. "Check him." The pitiful struggle of the murderous officer went heedless to Marzell, who was fully in survival mode. "He's breathing. He's not mobile. I don't think he's going to make it." The prone diversity security officer coughed, suddenly jerking to life. "Don't worry about me, Captain. I'm proud to serve. Let me stay here. I'll try to direct you." "Don't talk like that. I'm your captain. I haven't left anyone behind, and I don't plan to do so now." "Sir, you don't have a choice. Go. Get Beregev." Marzell knew the dying officer was right. Adrenaline and fear chemicals would keep him going for a while, but neither he nor the greenhorn who was with him knew medical enough to stabilize him. He didn't know how long it would take Grimp to arrive either. He was putting lots on the line for one single brand new crewmember. When the sacrificing officer had been seated in the command chair of the security hub, he startled Marzell and ended the CH-Cat who'd killed him. Right there, pinned to the floor by Marzell. Marzell lifted his hand and shook it. His initial reaction was anger. He wanted people like that to get justice, to give some answers for their actions, but then he stopped. He was branded a traitor already. The chaos would spark its rumors. No doubt his plentiful enemies within the cabinets of the Federation would pin him as the sole conspirator of all that was happening. What were a few extra nameless bodies? Besides, he doubted the officer would say anything anyway. Regardless, he, and the Turgs as a whole, had a legend to live up to. He had served in the Turg military before being a captain and made it out of quite a few sticky situations, keeping his squad alive to spite certain death. Then, as a captain, he'd negotiated the safe passage of his ship and its cargo through impossible odds. He was legendary for his leadership and ability to survive the unsurvivable. This wouldn't be any different. His ethics tossed aside and his head fully in the game, Marzell set to searching for a keycard or something he could use to override doors and put alarms at ease. When he found none, he came to the realization that the dead officer wouldn't be needing his hand for a fingerprint scan anymore and used his claws to rip it off. Marzell knew the names of his crew by heart. He knew the greenhorn, called Delk, was scared and freezing up. "It's all right, laddie. We've got to move. Unless you want to end up like him, Beregev is counting on you." He put a comforting paw on Delk's shoulder and stuffed the severed hand into a uniform pocket, realizing with a gesture that the ill-adapted too-small shirt had ripped at the shoulder. He never did care to get the standard-issue uniform tailored. "Find Beregev on the cameras. Lead us there. I'll bar the door. Keep him off you until we can get back, or Grimp gets to you." "Aye, Captain." With one last nod, Marzell exited stage left through the security station's only door, pausing to pilfer the plasma rifle of the lone guard. When he was outside, he motioned for Delk to follow him. Reluctantly, Delk did so, still shuddering at the image of the captain ripping off a hand. It would forever be burned into his brain. "Bar the door. I'll cover you. See if I can get this next door open. Hey in there. Are you still with us? What have you got?" "I found a passcode. It looks like..." "Yeah, with a lifeform scan. I see an unknown figure. Not far." Marzell, the snarls at war with itself. Marzell could hear the strain of injury on his voice, even though his communicator. He needed to work quickly. He felt Delk nervously staring at him. Marzell set to work opening the security door at the far end of the hall. He had spent enough time in the snarl to know his way roughly around the base. Besides, just today he had spent a long while slinking around to root out the cause of the communications outages. He was an old lizard. He had much knowledge of how government buildings were constructed. With mild surprise, the door opened when his severed hand trophy opened the security door. Down the hallway, he went following the directions from his guide. He had almost expected that not to work. The lights flickered as the floor shook. Marzell lost his balance and braced himself against the wall. "I take it that was you." Marzell breathed into his lifeline, the communicator, at his belt. "You know it. Something told me that we couldn't get any more outlawed after today. Hurry to the security station right by the airlock. Anybody outside of trusted crew is hostile. We found out the hard way." Marzell didn't need Grimp to respond. He knew that he had been heard. He also knew that his childhood best friend would follow him to hell and back. Of that he was certain. Turgs were loyal to a fault, something with their primal reptilian brain. Marzell could hear shouting and a scuffle through the door ahead of him. He got the feeling that bad was about to get worse. Some odd sixth sense he had developed while he was playing Army in the Federation military. Delk evidently didn't have this ability or sensitive hearing and was unaware of the unknown on the other side of the door. "Stack, opposite side. There's something on the other side." The snarl rumbled again. Grimp must be doing explosive things again. Marzell didn't think too much about it. He had known about his stash of illicit explosives for a long time. Quickly then, Marzell pressed his fleshy master key to the door locking mechanism. With a hiss, the security door slid open. Marzell beheld a firefight in the making. Two apparent factions had appeared, indistinguishable in their standard issue uniforms, aside from one side foregoing the neutrality and sporting a planetary emblem, that of the Orngs. Marzell took cover behind a set of ribs. Delk sprang up and out from behind the wall he had been hiding behind and entered the linear funnel of death. One of the combatants noticed Marzell. Appearing to be friendly, she called out, "Marzell, sir, please help. They just..." Marzell wordlessly peeked as one of the unknown attackers fired at him, and his companions, expertly and coolly, began firing down the hall to aid his once-trapped apparent allies. Delk may be inexperienced, but he definitely had the ability to default to training or muscle memory. As one of the two heavy repeating blaster-wielding guards took a bolt to the head and slumped back. "Set!" Delk screamed, ensuring that he was heard. Marzell moved forward, taking position ahead of Delk, firing so quickly that his dulled senses began to blur together. He breathed in the metallic fumes of burning plasma, the sickly scent of charred flesh and burned textiles. He saw the formerly sterile walls, scarred with gray ash and smoke. He cleared the distance quickly and slammed his bulk into the last of the two guards who he had been fighting. With a brief moment of safety, he called for the staff, who appeared to be friendly. "Come up, I've got a prisoner. Secure the door." "Aye, Captain." Marzell kept his weapon trained on the surrendering guard, using his natural stature to his advantage as Delk held the rear and the snarl security officers took up positions at the door ahead of him. Where is the human?" "You're looking for the human? He's not going to tell you. We can show you. He came by here, that's why they got stuck with us. They were rear guard." Marzell, whatever happened for him to get taken, it's what's caused this. All this. As the friendly guard spoke, Marzell realized that he was correct, and that there wasn't any time to argue. His feeling of unease increased exponentially as time progressed. Marzell thought for only a half-second, and as he went to speak, he realized that he could feel fluctuations in air pressure as the halls were now free from security doors. Almost like there was a breach in the hull of the snarl somewhere close to them. Lead the way. Marzell gave himself more time to think by restraining the guard, suddenly sick with the idea of shedding more blood, needless in his eyes. Finishing that, he stood and gave a nod to the officer who'd called out to him. The officer began to trot down a side hallway as she came to an intersection, Marzell and Delk following in stride. "Grimp, what's your status?" "Heavy resistance, Marzell. We've got casualties. Nobody's friendly. We haven't made it far. Just to the security door control, we recovered our officer. We need to leave." Grimp's words were poignant. Marzell knew he was right. He kept up his speed, alarmingly fast for a Turg, in the hopes that Beregev was just around the corner. The next corner. As he wended through the halls and various atriums, the signs of conflict became ever-present and obvious. Ejected plasma batteries and scarring coated the floors and walls. Still steaming melted holes in walls, revealing pipes and wires behind them. The guts of the beast. To his horror, bodies accompanied each sign of struggle along with those foreign brass casings. All species, with no clear sides and no clear winner. Marzell wondered how the detective's assistants had moved so quickly into the ship. He didn't wonder long when they came to a malfunctioning door, a metal arm stuck in the track and preventing it from closing. It cycled through trying to close, hitting the arm, and then thinking for a second before opening and trying to close again. Each time it opened, Marzell could see one of the two who'd taken Beregev struggling to restrain the now one-armed human. Berejev's arm was stuck in the jamb of the door, and a slight blood trail led to one of the two clutching a bleeding wound at its chest. The other circled around Beregev. The human looked pale and sick. His fleshy arm was damp and smeared with blood. His thin fingers clamped tightly around the rescue knife of the guard who lay gasping against the wall. Marzell was impressed. Evidently, Beregev had realized that he had an arm that could detach from himself, and had used that to somehow get into this situation. Marzell was about to order the snarl security officer, the assistant to the detective, to surrender when the friendly security guard who had known Marzell's name jumped the gun and shot a hole in the back of the officer, mid-struggle with Beregev, before turning his blaster toward Marzell. The other aimed at Delk, awaiting the order to fire. Marzell felt a pit form in his chest. Betrayal. By one he'd saved no less. "I thank you for your naivety, Captain Marzell, but the human cannot be allowed to." Again Beregev was underestimated. He saw a threat and sprang into action. He slammed his weight into the guard targeting Marzell, jamming the knife up to the hilt into his side. Beregev screamed curses in some language Marzell didn't know. Delk defaulted and jumped back, trying to make himself look smaller as he started to shake, and Marzell fired at the other once friendly officer. As the whole interaction occurred, a group of armed personnel entered from the other side of the room that Marzell and Delk were in and began engaging Marzell and his companions. Marzell, Beregev, and Delk were stuck. There was the malfunctioning door, but that was exposed. Marzell thought what to do as he called for Delk to return fire. Beregev took cover behind a pillar and eyed the drop service weapon of the officer he had just killed. Marzell noticed that the new attackers weren't wearing security uniforms, but oily and stained techie jumpsuits. They wielded their weapons clumsily and with a sense of unfamiliarity. Marzell wondered if he ever would know what was going on. They did have some sense of coordination and began to fan out and advance toward the trio, laying down a blistering volley of fire. The deafening roar of a kinetic weapon outpaced its quieter energy counterparts. Marzell didn't have time to consider how they'd gotten a kinetic weapon. Out of nowhere, the ship began to rumble as if being pelted with hundreds of giant pebbles. Everyone briefly lost their footing, and Beregev took the let-up in enemy fire to dive for a weapon. He blind fired over a toppled ration dispenser, then froze, collapsing to sit against his cover, and started saying something to Marzell, frantically gesturing toward the walls of the room they were in. Something must have been wrong with Marzell's translator, or Beregev's voice modulator, because Marzell couldn't understand what he was saying. Beregev seemed terrified, hopeless, and manic. He kept shouting the same thing again and again. Now that they were experiencing resistance, the hostile force had slowed and taken cover themselves. The ether released from the hot energy weapons was choking and Marzell's eyes water. Yet he had a plan. It was the only way. Delk, move to Beregev. Take him back to the diversity. On my mark. The harsh instruction was just what Delk needed, and he slunk over toward Beregev. Through the door. Run for it when it opens. Marzell looked up and fired all through the room at any targets he could see, his ears ringing. Go, don't wait for me, I'll catch up. He took cover again just as they were getting through the door. He fired once as the door tried to close and sealed himself in with their attackers. In the dim glow of the medbay, Beregev slowly opened his eyes, his gaze settling on Turk, who sat beside his bed, her expression one of concern and curiosity. The human's face, marked by the trials of his ordeal, showed a flicker of hope. Where am I? Beregev's voice was hoarse, the translator seamlessly converting his words. You're safe, Turk replied gently, offering a comforting smile. You're aboard the Diverse. We found you. In a tough situation, but you're safe now. Beregev's eyes scanned the room, taking in the alien technology and unfamiliar faces, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of his memory, the attack, the escape, the overwhelming fear. My family, my crew. Are they? Turk exchanged a glance with Tend, who had just entered. The medical professional stepped forward, his voice steady. We're still piecing together what happened, but we're here to help you, not hurt you. Over the next few days, Beregev gradually came to terms with his situation. The crew of the Diverse treated him with a cautious kindness, eager to learn about his species and his story. With Turk's help, Beregev started to navigate his grief and confusion, finding solace in the ship's library, poring over data about the cosmos that had been beyond his reach. Captain Marzell, meanwhile, faced a conundrum. The human's presence on board sparked a mix of diplomatic curiosity and potential peril. After numerous discussions with his senior officers and extensive communication with Galactic Command, Marzell made a decision. They would help Beregev contact any possible human settlements or space stations. Humanity was not known to the Federation, making Beregev a being of significant interest and as well being a priority. As the Diverse approached the coordinates of a suspected human outpost, Marzell convened a meeting with Beregev, now more composed and curious about his rescuers. Beregev, we believe we've found a station operated by your species, Marzell announced. We can take you there, or you can stay with us until we figure out more about your origins. Beregev's relief was palpable. He had thought himself the last of his kind, a sole survivor in a cruel universe. I want to see if there are others, he said firmly, his voice tinged with hope. But I'd like to learn from you, too, and maybe, in time, help bridge the gap between our peoples. Marzell nodded, a plan forming. That's a wise choice. We'll assist in any way we can. In the meantime, you're welcome to continue learning with us, and perhaps share more about your home and history. Beregev spent weeks aboard the Diverse, learning their technologies and cultures, and in turn, teaching them about Earth, its history, and its people. His resilience and eagerness to integrate into the crew won him friends and supporters throughout the ship. When the Diverse finally reached the coordinates of the human outpost, the crew was tense with anticipation. They were greeted not by hostility, but by curiosity. The outpost was a research facility, one of many humanity had secretly established, hidden from the broader galactic community due to old fears and regulations. The reunion was emotional. Humans were indeed thriving in small pockets around the galaxy, unknown to the Federation. Beregev's story, a tale of survival and discovery, spread quickly among the stations, rekindling a hope for a reunion with the broader human diaspora. Marzell and his crew were hailed as heroes, diplomats who had bridged a gap that had existed in ignorance and fear. In the months that followed, formal relations were established. The Federation welcomed humans into their fold, intrigued by their resilience and driven by the peaceful outreach initiated by the crew of the Diverse. Beregev decided to split his time between the Diverse and the human outposts. As an ambassador of sorts, he worked to integrate human knowledge with the galactic community, ensuring that the horrors of his past would pave the way for a future of cooperation and unity. Captain Marzell watched as the stars shone brightly against the cosmos, a reminder of the endless possibilities that lay in the unknown. With Beregev by his side, looking out at the expanding horizon, he knew the universe had just grown a little bit larger, a little more familiar, and infinitely more hopeful.